A burned-down town. 7 survivors. 0 mercy. Widows and orphans. Chapter 1. Ash fell out of a dead sky. It drifted in wide gray flakes. It settled on the shoulders of Eldridge's heavy canvas duster. He wiped a hand across his jaw. The grit smeared against his stubble. It felt like pulverized glass. He spat black saliva into the dirt trail. The bay horse snorted. It tossed its heavy head. The iron bit clinked against flat teeth. The animal smelled the air. It sensed the ruin in the valley below. Eldridge laid a hand on the leather horn of his saddle. He scanned the basin. Smoke choked the gorge. It hung thick and stagnant between the craggy ridges. A forest fire burned green wood and smelled like sharp pine sap. This smoke carried a different foulness. It held the stench of milled lumber, scorched canvas, and burnt meat. The destruction sat heavy in the air. Eldridge guided the bay down the steep wagon track. Loose scree slid under the iron horseshoes. The descent took an hour. The temperature rose with every yard of lost elevation. The sky disappeared behind a blanket of charcoal haze. The sun became a dull orange smudge in the gray overhead. 0 birds sat in the dead pines. 0 animals moved in the dry brush. The valley held a heavy, total silence. Eldridge listened for the pop of burning timber. He listened for voices. He heard nothing but the crunch of the horse's hooves and the creak of his own saddle leather. The trail leveled out at the base of the canyon. The wagon road widened into a flat thoroughfare. Eldridge pulled back on the reins. The bay stopped. Eldridge looked at the disturbed earth on the shoulder of the road. 5 mounds of dirt sat in a row. They lined up parallel to the wagon ruts. The soil was dark and wet. It stood out against the pale, dry dust of the trail. Men turned up fresh earth from the deep ground. Eldridge reached down his right leg. He slid the leather rawhide loop off the hammer of his Colt Peacemaker. He kept his hand resting near the walnut grip. He read the layout of the road. Thick, tangled manzanita bushes flanked the left side of the trail. A sheer granite rock wall bordered the right. He checked the angles for a crossfire. He looked for shapes in the brush. The gray haze obscured the deep tree line. Nothing moved in the ash. Eldridge swung his leg over the saddle. His boots hit the dust. He wrapped the leather reins around a dead cedar branch. He tied a slip knot. He kneaded the horse ready for a fast pull. He stepped toward the fresh earth. The 5 graves sat shallow. Clods of heavy clay rested on top of the loose mounds. A rush job. Men dug deep to show respect. Men dug shallow to hide a mess and make a fast exit. These holes offered 0 dignity. Black blowflies swarmed the loose dirt. They buzzed in tight circles over the fresh soil. They smelled the rot seeping through the thin layer of clay. 3 wooden shovels lay discarded in the high weeds near the rock wall. Eldridge walked to the tools. He nudged the closest one with the toe of his boot. The wood handle held dark, wet stains. Sweat and dirt baked into the grain. The iron blade was blunt and cheap. Town tools. Thieves stole them from a hardware store or a mining shed. They dumped them in the weeds when the labor ended. Men in a hurry carried 0 dead weight. Eldridge squatted beside the center grave. He touched the loose soil. Cool to the touch. The digging happened hours ago, sometime before dawn. He stood and walked to the edge of the road. Rain from 3 days prior left a deep puddle in a wagon rut. The water dried up, but mud remained. The wet ground held a clear, frozen cast of the men who dug the holes. Eldridge studied the boot prints. He took his time. He read the story in the clay. He measured the depth of the heel strikes. He noted the shape of the toes. He counted the individual sets of treads overlapping in the mud. He found a deep heel strike on the left edge of the rut. A heavy man. The boots sank deep into the earth. Next to it, he spotted a pointed toe. A riding boot with a smooth, worn sole. He moved down the line. A third set of tracks showed a dragging left spur. The sharp iron wheel carved a long gouge in the mud with every step. Eldridge traced the drag mark. The man favored his right leg. A bad limp. He counted the distinct sole patterns. Square toes. Worn heels. Flat leather soles. Hobnailed miner boots. 10 men, Eldridge stated to the empty road. Maybe 12. He walked the perimeter of the work site. He found crushed, dried grass where men stood and watched the digging. He found the white paper flakes of hand-rolled cigarettes dotting the dirt. He found dark brown splashes of chewing tobacco spit drying on the rocks. He stepped closer to the first grave. A gleam of brass caught his eye. Eldridge bent down. He picked a shell casing from the dirt. A .44 cartridge. Fired. The brass felt light and empty in his palm. He inspected the primer cap. It bore a deep, off-center firing pin strike. He looked at the fresh dirt mound. He looked at the brass in his hand. The men in the graves took lead before they went into the ground. A firing squad on the side of the road. He looked at the 5 shallow mounds again. 0 markers sat at the heads of the graves. 0 crosses fashioned from twigs. 0 names scratched into the rock. Men murdered and discarded. Eldridge put the brass casing in his right coat pocket. He walked back to the mud rut. He read the tracks leaving the gravesite. The boot prints converged. They marched away from the dirt mounds. They headed down the wagon road. They pointed straight into the thickest part of the gray smoke. They led toward the town. Eldridge walked back to the bay horse. The animal shifted its weight. The ears pinned back flat against its skull. It smelled the blood in the dirt. It wanted to turn back up the mountain. "Stand," Eldridge said. He stepped to the right side of the horse. A scarred leather scabbard hung off the saddle rigging. The brass butt plate of a Springfield .45, a .70 carbine stuck out of the opening. Eldridge gripped the stock. He pulled the heavy rifle free. The metal felt cold. The barrel was a thick hexagon of blued steel. He flipped the trapdoor breech open with his thumb. A thick copper cartridge rested in the chamber. The lead nose of the bullet shone dull in the hazy light. He snapped the breech shut. The metal clicked sharp and loud in the dead silence of the valley. He pulled the heavy hammer back to half cock. He checked his gear. The staghorn handle of his heavy Bowie knife sat secure in the cross-draw sheath on his belt. The blade rested easy against his stomach. The Colt Peacemaker sat heavy on his right hip. He unbuttoned the front of his canvas duster to clear the draw. He took the leather reins in his left hand. He held the Springfield carbine in his right. He rested the heavy steel barrel against his right shoulder. He looked down the wagon road. The smoke formed a solid gray wall 50 yards ahead. The smell of burnt timber and ruin grew stronger on the stagnant air. He knew what waited for him inside the haze. 10 men. Maybe 12. Killers with heavy boots and cheap shovels. He offered zero trust to an empty road. He preferred the ground beneath his boots when the angles got tight. Eldridge pulled the horse forward. His boots crunched on the gravel. He walked into the smoke. Chapter 2. Eldridge walked out of the canyon. The town of Silver Drift sat in the basin. The settlement existed as a dark scar on the earth. Black timber skeletons clawed at the dead sky. Heat radiated from the ground and baked the air. Red embers pulsed inside the charred logs of the ruined buildings. White ash drifted on the dead wind. It coated the bay horse. It coated Eldridge's boots. The dust settled thick on his shoulders. He kept the Springfield carbine tight against his shoulder. He led the horse down the center of the main thoroughfare. He read the layout of the destruction. A saloon sat on the left. A mercantile sat on the right. Both structures burned down to their stone foundations. A cast-iron wood stove sat exposed in the center of the saloon ashes. A steel bank safe rested in the ruin of the assayer's office. The heavy vault door stood wide open. The interior held 0 silver. Dead men littered the street. Eldridge counted them as he walked. 7, 9, 12 bodies in the thoroughfare. The killers left them in the open. The scavengers stayed away. The thick smoke kept the buzzards out of the valley. He stopped beside a man sprawled near a hitching post. The man wore a leather blacksmith apron over a wool shirt. 3 bullet holes punched through his chest. Tight grouping. Shot from a short distance. The blacksmith held a heavy iron hammer in his right hand. He died swinging it. Another body lay draped over a wooden water trough. The water boiled away hours ago. The wood charred and splintered. The man's back held a massive exit wound. A shotgun blast tore through his spine. Eldridge tracked the buckshot spread to the destroyed boardwalk behind the trough. The man ran for cover. He took the blast from behind. Eldridge observed the tracks in the thick ash. Heavy boots. Hoofprints. The killers rode through the street and shot the men as they ran. Target practice. A slaughter with 0 resistance. The townsfolk offered 0 challenge to men with fast horses and heavy rifles. He walked further down the road. The bodies piled up near the center of town. Men dragged from their homes and places of business. Execution style. Brass casings glittered in the soot. Dozens of them. .44 to 40s, .45s. The same caliber as the brass by the shallow graves on the canyon road. Eldridge read the angles of the crossfire. He looked at the bullet strikes pockmarking the surviving brick chimneys. The killers positioned men on the rooftops of the taller buildings before the fires started. They blocked the exits at both ends of the street. They boxed the town in. A professional job. They planned the massacre and executed the angles with cold precision. They left 0 escape routes. The street dead-ended at a slight rise. A collapsed structure sat at the top of the hill. The white steeple lay shattered across the road. The heavy brass bell rested in a deep crater of ash. The church. The killers burned it, along with the rest of the town. The roof caved inward. The walls leaned at an extreme angle. Smoke curled from the ruined pews and the altar. Eldridge tied the bay to a scorched stump outside the churchyard. He wrapped the reins tight. He kept the Springfield in his right hand. He stepped over the fallen steeple. His boots crunched on shattered stained glass. Red and blue shards mixed with the gray ash. The glass fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces under his heels. He entered the nave. He moved down the center aisle. He checked the corners. He checked the deep shadows beneath the collapsed roof beams. 0 threats. 0 bodies. The men of the town gathered in the street to fight or surrender. They left the church empty. Eldridge reached the altar. The heavy oak table sat split down the middle. A large Bible lay open in the ashes. The pages curled and blackened at the edges. He turned his back to the altar. He prepared to walk out and search the rest of the ruins. A sound stopped him. A scrape. Wood on wood. He froze. He held his breath. He listened to the ruin. The embers popped. The wind shifted the loose tin roofing overhead. The iron bell chimed a dull note in the dirt outside. Then he heard it again. A drag. A muffled rustle. It came from beneath his boots. He lowered the Springfield. He pointed the barrel at the floor. He stepped off the altar platform. He crouched. He placed a bare hand against the scorched pine floorboards. He felt a faint vibration. Movement in the crawlspace below. He stood. He slung the Springfield over his shoulder by its leather strap. The heavy rifle settled against his back. He needed both hands. He reached across his stomach. His hand closed over the staghorn grip of the heavy Bowie knife. He pulled the wide blade from the leather sheath. The steel caught the dull, hazy light filtering through the broken roof. He knelt over the center aisle. He examined the floorboards. The fire burned away the varnish and charred the surface, but the tongue and groove joints remained intact. He brushed a layer of white ash away with his left hand. He located a wide seam between two broad planks. He drove the point of the Bowie knife into the gap. He leaned his weight onto the handle. The thick blade slid past the wood. He jammed it deep into the dark space. He twisted his wrist. The wood groaned. The iron nails squealed against the floor joists. Eldridge applied more pressure. He levered the staghorn handle down toward the floor. The thick spine of the knife bit into the adjacent board. The wood splintered. A loud crack echoed in the empty church. The plank popped loose from the joist. Eldridge grabbed the edge of the burnt wood with his left hand. He heaved upward. The remaining nails tore free from the crossbeams. He ripped the plank out of the floor and tossed it aside. The heavy wood clattered against the ruined pews. He jammed the Bowie knife under the next board. He repeated the process. He shattered the wood and pried it open. He used his shoulders and his back. He ripped a 3-foot hole in the church floor. He tossed the second board aside. A wave of stagnant, sour air rose from the dark gap. It smelled like sweat, fear, and damp earth. Eldridge leaned over the hole. The crawlspace sat pitch black. The light from the ruined roof did not reach the dirt foundation below. He sheathed the Bowie knife. He unhooked his Colt peacemaker. He cocked the hammer. The metallic click sounded like a hammer strike in the silent church. He aimed the heavy barrel into the dark. "Come out," Eldridge said, "or I shoot the shadows." A gasp echoed in the dirt space. A small high sound. A breath caught in a throat. A face emerged from the darkness. A woman. She crawled forward on her hands and knees. Her cotton dress hung in tatters. Thick black soot masked her skin. White streaks cut through the grime where tears washed the ash away. Her eyes showed wide and white in the gloom. They held pure terror. She looked at the heavy iron of the Colt. She looked at Eldridge. She shifted her body. Shapes moved behind her in the dirt. Small shadows huddled in the deep corners of the foundation. They pressed against the cold fieldstone walls. Eldridge lowered the gun. He adjusted his eyes to the gloom. Children. 6 of them. They clung to the woman and to each other. Their faces mirrored the woman's. Masks of black ash and white fear. They stared up at the hole in the floor. They stared at the tall man in the canvas duster with the gun in his hand. They offered zero sound. They waited for the final bullet. Eldridge uncocked the Colt. He holstered the gun. He rested his hands on his knees. He looked at the woman. He looked at the 6 children shivering in the dirt. Chapter 3. Eldridge rested his hands on his thighs. He created space between himself and the shattered floorboards. "Leave the hole," Eldridge said. "The air in the foundation is dead." The woman hesitated. She looked at the ruined roof. She looked at the smoke drifting through the shattered stained glass. She reached for the jagged edge of the floorboards. She hauled her body from the crawlspace. Her dress snagged on a rusted nail. The fabric tore. She ignored it. She reached into the dark hole. She pulled the children from the dirt. Eldridge observed them. 3 boys. 3 girls. The oldest boy looked 10 years old. He wore men's boots stuffed with rags to make them fit. The youngest girl looked 4. She clutched a wooden doll with a burned face. The children huddled around the woman. They formed a tight circle. They stared at Eldridge. Their eyes held zero trust. "State your name," Eldridge said. "Cora," the woman said. "Cora Jennings." Her voice rasped. The smoke ravaged her throat. She wiped a hand across her face. The ash smeared into a dark paste. "You hid in the dirt," Eldridge said. "My husband told us to run to the church," Cora said. "He told us to hide in the foundation. He barred the doors. He went to the street with his shotgun." "A shotgun blast killed a man near the water trough," Eldridge said. Cora closed her eyes. A tear cut a clean line across her dirty cheek. She opened her eyes. She looked at the floor. "Who did this?" Eldridge said. "A border gang," Cora said. "They rode in before sunrise. A man named Cale Bonner led them. He wore a heavy buffalo coat. He carried a silver-plated, repeating rifle. He rode a massive roan stallion." Eldridge logged the details. A buffalo coat in the heat. A silver rifle. A roan. Markers for a dead man. "They wanted the silver vault," Eldridge said. "The monthly shipment arrived yesterday," Cora said. The mine foreman locked the ingots in the assayer's safe. Bonner knew the schedule. Someone sold the information. They blocked the canyon road. They cut the telegraph wire. They shot the sheriff first. They shot my husband second. They left 0 survivors in the street," Eldridge said. "They gathered the men," Cora said. Her voice gained a hard edge. "We watched through the gaps in the wood. Bonner lined the townsfolk in the dirt. He demanded the combination to the vault. The foreman refused. Bonner shot him in the kneecaps. The assayer panicked. He opened the heavy iron door. Bonner's men loaded the silver into saddlebags. They loaded it onto pack mules. And they burned the town," Eldridge said. "Bonner ordered a slaughter," Cora said. "He told his men to leave 0 witnesses. They leveled their rifles. They shot the men in the spine as they ran. They threw oil lanterns through the windows of the houses. They threw torches onto the roofs. They wanted the fire to erase the evidence." Eldridge looked at the torn floorboards. The gap provided a clear view of the church doors and the street beyond. "You watched the execution," Eldridge said. "I watched them murder this town," Cora said. "I know Cale Bonner. I know the faces of his riders. I memorized the scars on their cheeks. I memorized the brands on their horses. I memorized the sound of their voices." Eldridge read the layout of the situation. He arranged the facts in his mind. "Bonner assumes he left 0 breathing witnesses," Eldridge said. "He laughed when the church steeple collapsed," Cora said. "He tipped his hat to the fire. He rode south. His men followed him." Eldridge looked at the children. The oldest boy clenched his jaw. He stared at the colt on Eldridge's hip. He held 0 fear in his eyes. He held pure anger. "I found 5 fresh graves on the canyon road," Eldridge said. The dirt sat loose. The shovels sat discarded in the brush. Men died during the raid. "The townsfolk returned fire at the start," Cora said. "Bonner buried his dead on the trail," Eldridge said. "He left a detail in the valley. Men with fast horses returned to a fresh slaughter. They scavenged the dead. They picked the gold teeth. They checked the pockets for silver dollars. They looked for survivors." Cora grabbed the youngest girl. She pulled the child against her torn dress. She looked at the open church doors. She looked at the ash falling in the yard. "We need a badge," Cora said. "I need to tell a marshal." "The nearest law sits in Fort Wallace," Eldridge said. "It is a 3-day ride north. Hard country. Bad water." "We have 0 horses," Cora said. "The fire took the stables. The fire took the wagons." Eldridge looked at the woman. He looked at the 6 orphans. He measured the distance to Fort Wallace. He weighed the burden of a slow escort against the speed of a border gang. The children presented a massive liability. They made noise. They required water. They slowed a horse. He faced the church doors. He looked at his bay horse tied to the stump. He looked at the heavy Springfield carbine in his hand. He read the obligations of his personal code. A ledger required balancing. Bonner held a massive debt. These witnesses provided the means to collect it. Eldridge returned his gaze to Cora Jennings. "Gather whatever survived the fire," Eldridge said. "I will take you to Fort Wallace." Chapter 4. Eldridge walked out of the church nave. He stepped into the ash of the churchyard. The smoke hung low over the ruined street. It obscured the far end of the thoroughfare. A sound broke the heavy silence of the dead valley. Iron horseshoes struck flat stone. The clatter echoed against the surviving brick chimneys. The sound moved slow and deliberate. Eldridge stopped. He read the rhythm of the approach. 2 horses, walking at a relaxed pace. Riders with zero fear of ambush. He turned back to the ruined doorway of the church. He looked at Cora. She stood near the altar, holding the youngest girl. The other children clustered behind her. "Keep the children flat against the floor," Eldridge said. "Offer 0 movement. Make 0 noise." Cora nodded. She pulled the children down. They vanished behind the cover of the splintered pews. Eldridge stepped away from the church entrance. He moved behind the thick trunk of the scorched oak stump. His bay horse stood tied on the opposite side, masked by the smoke. He leaned his shoulder against the charred wood. He raised the Springfield carbine. He sighted down the heavy hexagonal barrel. 2 riders emerged from the gray haze at the end of the street. They rode saddle-weary mustangs. They wore dust-covered canvas dusters and wide-brimmed hats pulled low over their eyes. Bandanas covered their mouths and noses to filter the ash. The first rider carried a Winchester repeating rifle across his saddle horn. He scanned the dead bodies in the street. The second rider led a pack mule by a thick rope. He held a long-barreled revolver in his right hand. He pointed the iron at the shadows of the ruined buildings. Bonner's scouts. They returned to pick the bones of Silver Drift. Eldridge tracked their movement. He measured the distance. 80 yards. They rode past the burned assayer's office. They ignored the empty vault. They rode past the collapsed saloon. They stopped near the center of town. The first rider pointed at the blacksmith, sprawled near the hitching post. He pointed at the heavy gold watch chain dangling from the dead man's vest pocket. The second rider laughed. The sound carried sharp and ugly on the stagnant air. He holstered his revolver. He swung his leg over the saddle. He prepared to dismount and claim the gold. Eldridge lowered the Springfield. He needed speed for close work, but the distance demanded precision. He preferred the heavy lead of the carbine, but a lever-action Winchester held superior fire rate. He needed to strike first and strike hard. He leaned the Springfield against the stump. He unhooked the rawhide loop from the hammer of the Colt Peacemaker. He drew the heavy revolver from his holster. The walnut grip felt solid in his palm. He stepped out from behind the stump. He stood in the center of the road. "Drop the iron," Eldridge said. His voice cut through the dead air. It carried the blunt force of a physical blow. The 2 riders snapped their heads toward the sound. They saw the tall man in the canvas coat standing near the ruined church. They saw the Colt leveled at their chests. The mounted rider reacted first. He whipped the Winchester up from the saddle horn. He levered around into the chamber. Eldridge cocked the hammer of the Colt. He fired. The .45 caliber bullet struck the mounted rider in the center of his chest. The heavy lead punched through the canvas duster. The impact shoved the man backward. He tumbled over the cantle of his saddle. His boots caught in the stirrups. The panicked Mustang bolted down the street, dragging the dead man through the ash. The second rider hit the dirt. He scrambled behind the wooden water trough. He drew his long-barreled revolver. He snapped a wild shot over the charred wood. The bullet chewed into the dirt near Eldridge's boots. Eldridge cocked the Colt again. He took a slow step forward. He kept his sights locked on the trough. "You hold zero leverage," Eldridge stated to the silent street. "Show yourself." The man popped up from behind the trough. He extended his arm to fire. Eldridge pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the man's shoulder. The long-barreled revolver spun into the ash. The man screamed. He dropped to his knees. He clutched his ruined shoulder. Blood poured through his fingers and stained the gray dust. Eldridge walked down the center of the road. He kept the Colt aimed at the man's head. He closed the distance. He stopped 3 feet from the kneeling scout. The man looked up. His eyes held pure terror. He saw zero mercy in Eldridge's face. "Bonner," Eldridge said. "Where does he ride?" The man gritted his teeth against the pain. "Go to hell." Eldridge thumbed the hammer of the Colt back to full cock. The metallic click snapped loud in the quiet street. "State the direction," Eldridge said, "or I leave you for the buzzards." The man stared at the heavy barrel. He surrendered the information. "South. The high pass. He makes for the border." Eldridge nodded. He uncocked the revolver. He holstered the weapon. He unhooked his heavy Bowie knife. He stepped behind the man. He grabbed a fistful of the scout's greasy hair. He yanked the head back to expose the throat. He drove the thick steel blade across the man's neck. A fast, deep cut. Zero hesitation. The man collapsed into the ash. The blood pooled fast. It soaked into the dead earth. Eldridge wiped the blade on the dead man's canvas coat. He sheathed the knife. He walked to the pack mule. The animal stamped its hooves and snorted at the smell of fresh blood. Eldridge took the lead rope. He walked down the street and caught the Mustang. He freed the dead rider from the stirrups and left the body in the dirt. He led the 3 animals back up the hill to the ruined church. Cora stood in the doorway. She watched him approach. She saw the blood on his boots. She saw the captured horses. "You killed them," Cora said. "They offered zero choice," Eldridge said. "Bonner will send more men when these 2 fail to report." He handed her the lead rope for the pack mule. "Gather the children," Eldridge said. "We have horses. We have zero time to waste." Chapter 5. Eldridge led the captured Mustangs through the smoke. He walked past the ruined livery stable. The main barn sat reduced to a square of black embers. The fire consumed the hay and the roof beams. A thick stone wall shielded a rear corral. The fire missed this corner of the property. A buckboard wagon sat parked against the stone wall. The canvas top burned away. Scorched metal hoops arched over the wooden bed like rib bones. Eldridge tied the Mustangs to a fence post. He walked to the buckboard. He kicked the rear right wheel. The iron tire rang against the packed dirt. He grabbed the wooden spokes. He threw his weight against the wheel. The hickory wood held firm. He crawled under the wagon bed. He inspected the steel axle. The metal held zero cracks. The grease boxes retained thick black tallow. The rig offered solid transport. A bray cut through the hazy air. Eldridge stood. He walked around the stone wall. A large brown mule stood tied to a cast-iron water pump. The animal stamped its hooves in the ash. The fire spooked the beast, but the thick leather halter kept it tethered. Eldridge approached the mule. He stroked its thick neck. He unknotted the rope from the iron pump. He led the mule back to the wagon. He searched the surviving tack room attached to the stone wall. He found a jumble of scorched leather harnesses and heavy iron chains. He carried the gear to the yard. He read the layout of the wagon tongue. He required a 3-animal pull. He worked the leather. He rigged the 2 saddle-weary mustangs to the main doubletree. They fought the unfamiliar harness. They pinned their ears and snapped their teeth. Eldridge popped a heavy leather strap against the nose of the lead horse. The animal settled. Eldridge rigged a makeshift singletree with a heavy iron chain. He hitched the brown mule to the front of the line. The heavy draft animal would break the trail. The mustangs would provide the speed. He led the team and the wagon back down the ruined street. The iron wheels crushed the charred debris. The sound echoed off the standing brick chimneys. Eldridge stopped the wagon in front of the church. Cora stood in the yard. The 6 children clustered around her. They held small canvas sacks and scorched blankets, the sum total of their surviving possessions. They stared at the wagon. They stared at the 2 dead scouts bleeding into the dirt 100 yards down the street. "Load the bed," Eldridge said. "Take position on the floorboards. Keep your heads below the side panels." Thomas moved first. The 10-year-old boy climbed over the rear tailgate. He reached down and hauled the younger children up by their arms. He settled them in the center of the bed. He arranged the scorched blankets over the floor. He took a seat at the rear edge. He gripped a heavy, charred table leg in his right hand. He held the wood like a club. He stared at the dead men in the street. Eldridge walked to the front of the wagon. He handed the long leather driving lines to Cora. "You take the bench," Eldridge said. Cora climbed up. She sat on the hard wooden seat. She wrapped the leather lines around her scarred hands. She tested the tension. The mustangs shifted. The mule held steady. She knew the feel of a heavy team. "The mustangs hold 0 training for a wagon," Eldridge said. "They will fight the bit. You must force them to pull." "I drove a freight team in Missouri," Cora said. "I can handle a rough rig." Eldridge nodded. He turned and walked to his bay horse. He swung his leg over the saddle. He pulled the Springfield carbine from the scabbard. He rested the heavy steel barrel across his lap. He pointed his horse toward the eastern edge of the ruined town. "Follow my track," Eldridge said. He spurred the bay. Cora cracked the lines over the backs of the mustangs. The wagon lurched forward. Eldridge bypassed the main canyon road. The deep mud ruts offered an easy path for the wagon, but they held the tracks of 10 men. They also captured the imprint of iron wheels and fresh horseshoes. He needed a route that concealed their exit. He guided the bay through a gap in the skeletal pine trees. He rode toward a deep cut in the canyon floor. A dry wash carved a winding path through the basin. Flash floods dug the trench over centuries. The water dried up weeks ago. The riverbed sat wide and flat. Bleached white river stones covered the bottom. High banks of red clay and tangled manzanita bushes flanked the wash. Eldridge rode his horse down the steep embankment. The bay slid on the loose shale. Its hooves hit the smooth river stones. He turned in the saddle. Cora eased the wagon down the embankment. The mustangs fought the steep angle. The buckboard skidded sideways. The rear wheels locked. Cora hauled back on the lines. She shouted a harsh command. She cracked the leather against the mule's rump. The mule dug its hooves into the dirt. It pulled the wagon straight. The buckboard crashed down onto the riverbed. The iron wheels slammed against the smooth rocks. The noise filled the narrow trench. The steel tires ground against the stones. The heavy wood groaned under the impact. The children bounced in the bed. Thomas held the younger ones down. He wedged his boots against the side panels to brace his weight. Cora brought the team to a halt. She looked at the rocky path ahead. She looked at Eldridge. "The rocks will shatter the wooden spokes," Cora said over the noise. "The iron rims will warp." "The rocks hold 0 tracks," Eldridge said. "Mud and dust point a clear path. Stone offers 0 direction to a hunting party. We trade the wheels for the cover." "The noise carries," Cora said. "The high banks muffle the echo," Eldridge said. "Keep the team moving. Do not stop for broken tack. Do not stop for tired animals." Eldridge turned his horse. He rode point. The wagon followed. The iron wheels crushed the brittle river stones. The sound mirrored the crunch of grinding bones. The dry wash twisted through the landscape. It snaked away from the ruined town and headed toward the high desert. The heat in the trench grew intense. The red clay banks trapped the dead air. The sun burned a hole through the gray smoke overhead. The light hit the white rocks and reflected upward. The temperature in the dry riverbed baked the moisture from the air. Eldridge wiped sweat from his jaw. The grit in the ash smeared against his skin. He scanned the high ridges bordering the wash. The terrain above sat thick with dry scrub oak and jagged granite boulders. A scout on the ridge could spot the wagon in the trench. A rifleman could fire down into the open bed. He maintained a gap of 50 yards between his horse and the buckboard. He read the layout of the trench ahead. He checked the blind corners before the wagon rounded the bends. He kept his thumb near the hammer of the Springfield. Hours bled away. The white rocks punished the animals. The mustangs lathered with white sweat. The mule kept its head down and pulled the dead weight. The children in the back remained silent. They endured the brutal jolts of the iron wheels with 0 complaints. Fear locked their voices in their throats. Eldridge looked at the sky. The sun sat 2 hands above the western peaks. Shadows lengthened inside the dry wash. The air began to cool. He ran the timeline in his head. He measured the distance between Silver Drift and the southern pass. Cale Bonner expected his 2 scouts to return with scavenged gold. He expected a report on the dead town. The men held 0 capacity to deliver that report. When the sun hit the peaks, Bonner would know his men encountered resistance. He would know someone survived the slaughter. A border gang leader built his reputation on total fear. He left 0 loose ends. Bonner would send riders back to the ashes. They would find the bodies of the scouts. They would find the missing buckboard. They would hunt. Eldridge adjusted his grip on the Springfield. He watched the high ridges. He watched the shadows stretch across the white stones. He knew the riders were coming. Chapter 6. Cale Bonner reined his massive roan stallion to a halt. The beast blew hot air from its nostrils. The iron bit clinked against flat teeth. Bonner surveyed the main street of Silver Drift. The town offered nothing but black timber and white ash. Embers pulsed in the ruins. Bonner wore a heavy buffalo coat. The thick hide trapped the heat of the canyon, but he kept it buttoned tight against his throat. He carried a silver-plated Winchester repeating rifle across his saddle horn. The engraved metal caught the dull light. 8 riders sat their horses behind him. They held their rifles ready. They expected a quiet sweep of a dead town. Bonner spotted the first body. A canvas duster in the dirt. He spurred the roan. He rode to the center of the street. He looked down at his dead scout. A single bullet hole punched through the center chest of the duster. The man stared blind at the dead sky. Blood soaked the gray ash. "Find the other one," Bonner said. 2 riders dismounted. They searched the ruins. A shout came from the collapsed church. Bonner turned the roan. He rode to the edge of the churchyard. The second scout lay sprawled behind a charred water trough. Bonner swung his leg over the saddle. He dropped to the dirt. He walked to the body. He nudged the dead man with the toe of his boot. The scout's shoulder hung ruined. Shattered bone poked through the bloody canvas. The killing blow sat higher. A deep, clean slice opened the man's throat from ear to ear. The blood pooled thick and dark in the soot. Bonner squatted. He read the story in the dirt. He had a tracker's eye. He read the layout of the fight. He saw the boot prints of his scouts. He found a third set of tracks. A man with a flat-soled riding boot. A heavy stride. The man stood his ground in the center of the street. He shot the first scout from the saddle. He shot the second scout behind cover. He walked up and finished the job with cold steel. He took their horses, a rider said. He took the pack mule. Bonner stood. He walked to the church. He saw the shattered floorboards. He looked into the dark crawl space. The scent of sweat and fear lingered in the damp earth. He looked at the disturbed ash outside the church. He took a buckboard, Bonner said. He rigged a 3-animal pull. 2 horses and the mule. A scavenger? The rider asked. A scavenger runs from a fight, Bonner said. This man walked into the iron. He cut a throat. He found rats in the floorboards. He loaded a wagon. Bonner walked back to his roan. He tracked the deep grooves of the iron wagon wheels. The trail led away from the canyon road. It pointed toward the deep cut of the dry wash. He understood the tactic. White river stones hid tracks. The high clay banks muffled noise. They ride for Fort Wallace, Bonner said. They seek a badge. They hold a massive head start. He mounted the roan. He racked the lever of the silver Winchester. A brass cartridge chunked into the chamber. They drive a heavy wagon, Bonner said. They pull dead weight. We ride light. We ride fast. We run them down before they clear the salt flats. Mount up. The 8 riders turned their horses. They followed the roan. They rode toward the dry wash. The buckboard cleared the high clay banks of the trench. The terrain opened into the high desert. The heat broke. A cool wind swept across the flat earth. Dry sagebrush and twisted yucca plants dotted the cracked soil. Eldridge raised his left hand. Cora hauled back on the heavy leather driving lines. The mustangs fought the bit. The mule stopped. The wagon lurched and settled in the dust. The iron wheels groaned. Eldridge swung down from the bay horse. He tied the reins to the side panel of the buckboard. He carried the Springfield carbine in his right hand. He walked to the rear tailgate. The 6 children sat on the floorboards. They clutched their canvas sacks. The brutal jolts of the river stones bruised their bones. Dust coated their skin and their clothes. They looked at Eldridge. "Stand up," Eldridge said. The children stood. They held the side panels for balance. Eldridge looked at their faces. He needed to set the layout of the journey. He needed compliance for survival. "We cross open country," Eldridge said. The canyon offered cover. The desert offers zero. Sound travels for miles on the flat earth. Dust marks a trail. He looked at the youngest girl. She held her burned wooden doll. "You will experience pain," Eldridge said. "The wagon rides hard. You will feel cold tonight. You will feel hunger. You will offer 0 complaints. You will make 0 noise. A cry or a shout brings dead men to our position." He looked at Cora on the driver's bench. "We light 0 fires at night," Eldridge said. "Smoke signals our camp. A flame draws a rifle bead. We sleep in the dark. We eat cold rations. We suffer the freeze." Cora nodded. She wrapped the leather lines around her hands. "Understood." Eldridge turned away. He prepared to mount the bay. "I require a weapon," a voice said. Eldridge stopped. He turned back to the wagon bed. Thomas stood at the tailgate. The 10-year-old boy gripped the charred table leg in his left hand. He looked straight at Eldridge. He offered zero flinch. "You have a club," Eldridge said. "A stick stops a dog," Thomas said. "It fails against a rifle. I watched the men in the street. I watched my father die. I need iron." Eldridge studied the boy. He read the anger in his jaw. He read the desperation in his grip. A child with a gun presented a massive hazard. Fear induced panic. Panic induced wildfire. A wild shot killed an ally. "A gun demands a heavy toll," Eldridge said. "The kick shatters a small wrist. The noise blinds the senses. You hold zero training." "I can learn," Thomas said. "We lack the time," Eldridge said. Thomas tightened his grip on the wood. "I will protect my sisters." Eldridge stepped closer to the tailgate. He unbuttoned the right pocket of his canvas coat. He reached inside. His fingers touched the cold steel of a spare cylinder for the Colt Peacemaker. He carried it for a fast reload in a heavy gunfight. 6.45 caliber cartridges sat loaded in the chambers. The heavy brass and lead weighed over 2 pounds. He pulled the cylinder from his pocket. He held it out. "Drop the wood," Eldridge said. Thomas dropped the table leg. It clattered on the floorboards. He reached out his right hand. Eldridge placed the loaded cylinder in the boy's palm. Thomas grunted. The weight surprised him. His arm dropped an inch before he secured his grip. "That is solid steel and heavy lead," Eldridge said. "It operates as the heart of my revolver. When the fighting starts, I will empty my gun. I will demand that cylinder. You will hand it to me with zero hesitation." Thomas looked at the brass primer caps. He looked at Eldridge. "If a man breaches this wagon bed before I reload," Eldridge said, "you grip the center pin. You swing the metal. You strike the man in the face. You crush his nose. You break his jaw. You use the weight." Thomas closed his fingers around the steel. He nodded. "I hold it ready." "Sit down," Eldridge said. "Keep your heads below the wood." Thomas turned. He sat in the center of the children. He kept the heavy steel cylinder in his lap. He kept his hands over the metal. Eldridge walked past the wagon. He climbed a small ridge of loose shale and scrub oak. He gained 20 feet of elevation. The wind whipped the tails of his coat. He looked south. He tracked the line of the dry wash. The sun dropped toward the western peaks. The sky burned a harsh, bruised purple. A shape formed on the southern horizon. It started as a smudge. It grew into a thick, brown pillar. A dust cloud. It rose high above the clay banks of the trench. The wind pushed the top of the cloud, but the base moved steady and fast along the trail. Fast horses chewed the dry earth. Men pushed their animals to the breaking point. Eldridge watched the dust. He measured the distance. He read the speed of the pursuit. He assessed the gap. 10 miles. Maybe 8. The wagon moved like a crippled insect. The riders moved like a wildfire. The hunt was on. Eldridge walked down the ridge. He reached the bay horse. He swung his leg over the saddle. He settled his weight. He pulled the Springfield from the scabbard and rested it across his lap. "Whip the mule," Eldridge said. "We burn the daylight." Chapter 7. The wagon groaned. The wooden spokes protested the rough terrain. The iron rims ground against the loose shale. The dry riverbed gave way to a steep decline. Eldridge rode point. The bay horse navigated the broken footing. They reached the bottom of a deep gorge. A fast creek cut across their path. The water churned white over smooth stones. Eldridge stopped at the bay at the water's edge. He read the layout. Sheer rock walls boxed them in on both sides. The creek ran deep in the center channel. Slick mud lined the banks. A natural ambush point. A choke point with 0 alternate routes. Cora hauled the heavy leather reins. The buckboard stopped. The mule snorted. The animal smelled the deep water. It smelled the slick mud. It planted its hooves in the dirt. "Drive the beast," Eldridge said. "The water covers the wheel hubs. The current carries force. You must maintain forward momentum." "He refuses the mud," Cora said. "Whip his hide," Eldridge said. "He moves or he drowns. The canyon funnels our tracks to this exact spot. We sit in a shooting gallery." Cora slapped the reins against the mule's flanks. The animal tossed its head. It shifted its weight toward the wagon. The wagon rolled an inch in reverse. Thomas stood in the wagon bed. He gripped the wooden side rails. He looked at the rushing water. The younger children huddled under the soot-stained blankets. "He smells the cold," Thomas said. "He smells the fear," Eldridge said. "He requires a heavy hand." Eldridge reached for the leather quirt tied to his saddle horn. He prepared to strike the mule. A pebble bounced off the rock wall. It clattered against the shale. Eldridge stopped his hand. He looked up. He scanned the eastern ridge. The cliff face rose 60 feet above the creek bed. 3 men appeared on the rim. They staggered their horses. They wore dust-covered canvas coats. They rode deep-chested quarter horses. The sun caught the steel barrels of their Winchester rifles. Bonner's scouts. The advance party. They looked down at the wagon, stuck in the mud. They smiled. They held the high ground. They held the angle. The lead rider levered his rifle. He aimed at the creek bed. He pointed the barrel at Cora. "Whip the mule," Eldridge roared. "Whip him now." Cora stood on the buckboard. She grabbed the ends of the thick reins. She swung her arm. She struck the mule across the hindquarters. The leather cracked like a pistol shot. She struck the beast a second time. She yelled a primal sound. The mule screamed. The pain overrode the hesitation. The animal lunged forward. Its hooves broke the mud. It plunged into the freezing creek. The wagon tipped over the steep bank. The heavy rig crashed into the water. White spray soaked the buckboard. The children screamed. The iron wheels sank deep into the silty bottom. The rushing current slammed against the wooden sideboards. The wagon shuddered. The lead rider fired. The bullet punched through the canvas wagon hoop. It missed Cora by an inch. It splintered the wood near her head. Eldridge dug his spurs into the bay horse. He hauled the reins to the right. He abandoned the water crossing. He charged a steep, rocky incline bordering the creek. The slope consisted of loose scree and jagged boulders. The bay scrambled up the face. Hooves slipped on the loose stone. Eldridge leaned over the horse's neck. He shifted his weight toward the mane. He drove the animal upward. A second bullet struck the dirt near the horse. The second rider joined the fight. The bay crested a narrow stone shelf cut into the middle of the canyon wall. Eldridge pulled the reins. The horse slid to a halt. Dust plumed around the hooves. Eldridge leveled the tactical deficit. He matched the rider's altitude. He flanked their position. He drew the Springfield .45 .70 carbine from the leather scabbard. He brought the heavy wooden stock to his shoulder. He thumbed the hammer. The sear clicked into place. The lead rider tracked the wagon. He ignored the horsemen. He leveled his Winchester for a second shot at Cora. Eldridge lined the iron sights on the man's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. A massive cloud of white gun smoke erupted from the muzzle. The recoil punched Eldridge in the shoulder. The heavy lead slug crossed the gorge. It struck the lead rider in the center of his rib cage. The impact lifted the man from his saddle. The force threw him over the horse's rump. He tumbled over the edge of the cliff. He plummeted 60 feet. He hit the creek with a bone-shattering impact. Water splashed 10 feet high. The body sank. The second rider wheeled his horse. He searched for the source of the heavy fire. He spotted the smoke on the rock shelf. He swung his Winchester toward Eldridge. Eldridge flipped the trapdoor mechanism open. The smoking brass casing ejected. It tumbled over the cliff edge. Eldridge reached into his coat pocket. He retrieved a fresh paper-patched cartridge. He shoved the brass into the open breech. He slammed the trapdoor shut. He cocked the hammer. The second rider fired. The bullet chipped the rock face 2 feet above Eldridge's head. Stone fragments showered his canvas coat. Eldridge ignored the debris. He held his aim steady. He sighted the center mass of the second rider. He pulled the trigger. The rifle boomed. The .45 caliber bullet tore through the man's throat. Blood sprayed in a wide arc. The Winchester slipped from his hands. The man slumped forward. He pitched over the side of his horse. He bounced off a jagged outcropping. He crashed into the mud bank below. He rolled lifeless into the rushing water. The third rider saw the slaughter. He yanked his reins. He spurred his horse hard. He turned his back to the gorge. He tried to run. Eldridge opened the breech. The empty brass flipped clear. He jammed a third round into the chamber. He closed the trapdoor. He pulled the hammer to full cock. The third rider spurred his horse into a sprint. He leaned low over the saddle. Eldridge tracked the moving target. He led the man by a fraction of an inch. He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield fired its third heavy round. The slug punched through the bandit's back. It shattered his spine and exited his chest. The man went rigid. His hands released the reins. He slid off the saddle. He tangled in the stirrup for a brief second. The leather tore. He fell into the brush at the edge of the rim. He rested in the dirt. His horse continued to run. It disappeared over the ridge. Silence returned to the canyon. The echo of the heavy rifle faded into the rocks. The white smoke drifted on the wind. Eldridge looked down at the creek. The water ran dark with blood. The two bodies bumped against the smooth stones in the shallows. The mule found solid footing. It dragged the heavy wagon up the far bank. The iron wheels crested the mud. The rig rolled onto the dry shale. Cora hauled the reins. She stopped the wagon. She dropped the leather straps. She turned. She checked the children. The 6 orphans sat huddled on the floorboards. Water soaked their clothes. They shook from the cold and the terror. 0 injuries. Eldridge lowered the Springfield carbine. He cracked the trapdoor. The final empty casing popped out. He caught the hot brass in his gloved palm. He crushed it in his fist. He placed the rifle across his saddle pommel. He opened his heavy canvas coat. He looked down at his leather bandolier. He slid his fingers over the empty loops. He counted the brass cartridges. The heavy rifle carried massive stopping power. It required precise reloading. It consumed ammunition fast. Eldridge measured his supply. He held 7 rounds for the Springfield. 7 heavy bullets to stop Bonner and his main force. He closed the canvas coat. He buttoned it against the wind. He turned the bay horse. He rode down the steep rocky shelf to join the wagon. Chapter 8. The sun dropped behind the jagged rim of the western ridge. The light bled from the sky. Shadows consumed the dry riverbed. The temperature plunged. The baked canyon earth lost its heat. The air turned brittle. Cold wind rushed through the stone corridor. It bit through Eldridge's heavy canvas coat. It punished the children in the wagon bed. The orphans lacked winter gear. They wore thin cotton shirts and denim overalls. The morning fire took their coats. The fire took their blankets. They shivered in the back of the wooden rig. Their teeth chattered. The sound mixed with the grind of the heavy wagon wheels against the loose shale. The fire in the town warped the iron rims. The wooden spokes rattled in the hubs. The entire rig groaned under the strain of the uneven ground. The youngest girl coughed. The sound broke the steady rhythm of the march. A dry, hacking scrape. It echoed off the sheer granite walls. The noise bounced down the canyon. It rang in the fading light. Eldridge raised a gloved hand. Cora pulled the leather reins. The mule stopped. The bay horse halted. Eldridge sat in the saddle. He listened. The canyon held zero other sounds. The wind hummed through the dry brush. The girl coughed again. A violent spasm racked her small frame. The sound mirrored tearing canvas. Eldridge dropped from the saddle. His boots hit the dirt. He walked back to the buckboard. Cora held the 4-year-old against her chest. She wrapped the child in a soot-stained shawl. The girl gasped for air. Her chest heaved. The smoke damaged her lungs, Cora said. The cold air settles in her chest. She needs a fire. She needs warm water. A fire provides a beacon, Eldridge said. The flames give our position away. Her chest rattles, Cora said. She struggles to breathe. Her cough travels a mile in this rock channel, Eldridge said. It acts as a signal flare. The rock walls amplify the sound. The men behind us track by sound in the dark. I hold zero medicine, Cora said. Press a wet rag over her mouth, Eldridge said. Muffle the noise. We need cover. Eldridge turned away from the wagon. He took the reins of the bay horse. He advanced on foot. He read the layout of the canyon walls. The darkness played tricks on the eyes. The sheer cliffs offered false openings. Shadows looked like deep caves. Solid rock looked like empty space. Eldridge relied on the wind. The wind rushed past solid stone. It swirled into open gaps. He felt a shift in the air current. He turned his face. A breeze pulled toward the western wall. He followed the draft. He found a seam in the rock face. A vertical fracture split the solid granite. He led the bay to the opening. He stepped inside. The fissure ran deep into the cliff. The rock walls stood shoulder-width apart at the entrance. The space expanded in the back. The floor consisted of soft sand and crushed limestone. The wind died inside the gap. The heavy stone blocked the chill. It offered a natural vault. Eldridge walked back to the trail. The night turned pitch black. The stars offered minimal light. He found the wagon by the shape of its silhouette. Turn the mule, Eldridge said. Guide the rig toward the west wall. Cora slapped the reins. The mule refused to budge. The beast smelled the cold. It felt the exhaustion. It planted its hooves in the dirt. Eldridge stepped to the front of the harness. He grabbed the iron bit. He wrapped the thick leather reins around his forearms. He planted his boots in the shale. He used his back. He pulled against the dead weight of the animal. The mule surrendered. It stumbled forward. Its iron shoes struck sparks against the loose rocks. Eldridge kept a tight grip. He dragged the animal toward the dark gap. Keep the children flat, Eldridge said. He guided the mule into the narrow opening. The wagon hub scraped the stone walls. The iron rims shrieked against the granite. The wood groaned under the pressure. The sound cut through the night. Eldridge ignored the noise. He needed the wagon inside the rock. He pulled the rig to the back of the fissure. The rock walls parted. The space opened. The wagon rolled to a stop in the soft sand. Eldridge tied the bay horse to a heavy boulder near the rear wall. The darkness inside the fissure felt absolute. Eldridge moved by touch and memory. "Keep them in the wagon bed," Eldridge said. "The air feels warmer," Cora said. "The stone traps the heat from the day," Eldridge said. "It traps the sound. Let the girl cough." The youngest girl unleashed a violent fit. The hacking echoed inside the confined space. The rock walls absorbed the noise. Zero sound escaped to the trail. The mule tossed its head. The iron rings on the harness clanged. The beast kicked the sand. Eldridge walked to his saddlebags. He unbuckled the leather flaps. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from the pouch. He shook the dust from the fabric. He approached the mule. He draped the thick wool over the animal's head and neck. He tied the corners under the jaw. "Bind the iron rings," Eldridge said. Cora tore a strip of fabric from her ruined dress. She tied the cotton around the harness rings. She silenced the metal. The mule stood still under the heavy blanket. Eldridge turned his attention to his gear. He opened his long canvas coat. He checked the Colt Peacemaker on his right hip. He unclasped the retaining strap. He pulled the heavy revolver from the leather. He felt the weight in his palm. He checked the cylinder. Full. He holstered the gun. He reached across his stomach. His fingers found the staghorn handle of his heavy Bowie knife. He gripped the textured bone. He slid the wide steel blade from the leather sheath. The metal rasped against the leather. The sound carried in the quiet space. The blade measured 10 inches. The spine held a 1/4 inch of solid steel. A crossguard of thick brass separated the blade from the handle. He preferred the knife for the dark. A gunshot illuminated the canyon. A gunshot announced his position to the entire hunting party. The knife offered a quiet solution. It isolated the violence. It kept the rest of the gang blind. A shape moved in the back of the wagon. Thomas stood. The 10-year-old boy climbed over the wooden buckboard. He dropped into the soft sand. He stood in front of Eldridge. "I hold the spare cylinder," Thomas said. His voice carried zero tremble. "Show me," Eldridge said. The boy opened his right hand. The heavy steel cylinder rested in his palm. Grease coated the metal. 6 lead bullets sat loaded in the chambers. The brass casings gleamed in the faint starlight bleeding from the fissure entrance. "I guard the wagon," Thomas said. Eldridge looked down at the boy. He measured the resolve in the child's posture. He read the anger in the boy's clenched jaw. "You hold your position," Eldridge said. "You stay in the dark. You see a shadow in the entrance, you remain silent. You let the shadow pass." "They killed my father," Thomas said. "They kill you with zero hesitation," Eldridge said. "You lack the reach. You lack the weight. You provide a distraction. You protect the girls. You keep them quiet. You leave the killing to me." Thomas closed his fist around the heavy cylinder. He nodded. He climbed back into the wagon bed. He sat beside Cora. Eldridge looked at the woman. "Keep your hands on the children," Eldridge said. "Do not leave the fissure. I return before dawn." "What if you fail?" Cora said. "I hold zero plans for failure," Eldridge said. "You hear gunfire, you stay put. Bonner sends his riders in pairs. They stagger their formation. They search the shadows. I read their rhythm. I break it." "We wait in the dark," Cora said. "You keep the children warm," Eldridge said. "You wait for sunrise. You see my face, we move. You see another face, you run deep into the stone." Eldridge turned toward the opening. He kept the heavy Bowie knife in his right hand. The blade rested flat against his thigh. He stepped out of the soft sand. He walked to the narrow entrance. The wind hit his face. The canyon chill returned. He stepped out of the fissure. He stood on the trail. The black rock walls towered above him. The dry riverbed stretched into the dark. He adjusted his vision to the gloom. He listened to the wind. He placed his boots on the loose shale. He controlled his weight. He made zero noise. He turned south. He walked back into the night. He went to hunt the trackers. Chapter 9. Eldridge walked south in the dry riverbed. The wind carved through the granite canyon. It bit at his face and tore at the hem of his heavy canvas coat. The temperature plunged near freezing. The darkness felt absolute. The high rock walls blocked the starlight. He navigated the broken ground by memory and touch. He placed his boots flat on the loose shale. He controlled his weight transfer. A sliding rock meant noise. Noise meant a bullet in the dark. He kept his right hand resting on the staghorn handle of the heavy Bowie knife. The Colt Peacemaker held 6 rounds of lead, but a gunshot acted as a signal flare in the narrow canyon. It announced his exact position to the rest of the hunting party. The knife offered a silent solution. He smelled the mesquite smoke before he saw the light. The scent drifted on the north wind. It cut through the cold air. The smell of burning wood and boiling coffee mixed with the canyon dust. Eldridge stopped. He read the air currents. The smoke originated from a bend in the riverbed a quarter-mile ahead. He judged the mistake. Men hunting in the dark require 0 fires. Bonner hired fools. They craved comfort over discipline. Comfort created targets. Eldridge moved toward the bend. He stayed close to the western rock wall. He used the deep shadows for cover. He rounded the corner of a massive granite outcropping. A faint orange glow pulsed in a shallow depression near the creek bank. Eldridge climbed a low ridge of limestone. He dropped to his stomach. He crawled to the edge. He looked down at the camp. 2 men sat beside a small fire. They built the flame in a pit to hide the light. It failed to mask the smoke. The men wore heavy woolen coats buttoned to their necks. They held tin cups in their bare hands. A black enamel coffee pot sat on a flat stone near the red coals. Their horses stood tied to a dead cottonwood tree 30 yards away. The animals huddled together for warmth. Eldridge read the layout of the camp. The first man sat on a leather saddle, dropped in the dirt. He kept a Winchester repeating rifle across his lap. His hands remained occupied with the hot tin cup. The second man sat on a bedroll. His rifle leaned against a rock 3 feet out of his reach. Both men stared into the fire pit. The flames ruined their night vision. The crackle of the burning mesquite masked the sounds of the wind. They blinded and deafened themselves. Eldridge examined the approaches. The depression offered one viable route of entry. A narrow path ran between 2 large boulders behind the men. The path sat in total darkness. The men faced away from it. Eldridge backed away from the limestone ridge. He descended the rock face. He drew the heavy Bowie knife from its leather sheath. The thick steel caught 0 light. The brass crossguard felt cold against his knuckles. He approached the gap between the boulders. He stepped into the shadow. He waited. He timed his breathing to the wind. He listened to the men talk. "Bonner wants the woman alive," the first man said. His voice carried over the popping embers. "Bonner wants the silver," the second man said. "The woman means nothing. He wants to make an example of her." "The wind freezes the marrow in my bones," the first man said. He raised his tin cup. He took a drink of the black coffee. "We should ride back to the main camp. The wagon tracks vanish in the rocks. We ride back empty-handed. Bonner puts a bullet in your head, the second man said. We wait for dawn. We find the tracks. Eldridge stepped out of the dark. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. He moved with zero sound. The fire cast his tall shadow over the seated men. The first man lowered his cup. He noticed the shadow. He raised his head. He opened his mouth to shout. Eldridge drove the heavy steel blade into the center of the man's chest. The thick spine of the knife parted the heavy woolen coat. It snapped the breastbone. It pierced the heart. Eldridge twisted the staghorn handle. The man dropped his tin cup. The hot coffee splashed across the dirt. The liquid hissed against the coals. The man's hands clawed at Eldridge's canvas coat. Eldridge ripped the blade free. Blood followed the steel. The man slumped backward off the saddle. He hit the ground dead. The second man scrambled. He kicked dirt into the fire pit. He reached for the Winchester, leaning against the rock. His fingers brushed the wooden stock. Eldridge pivoted on his heel. He swung his right arm in a tight, violent arc. He kept the Bowie knife in a reverse grip. The heavy brass crossguard functioned as a set of iron knuckles. The solid brass slammed into the side of the second man's face. The impact shattered the man's jawbone. Teeth fractured. The bone broke with a loud crack. The man screamed a broken, wet sound. He collapsed onto his side in the dirt. He clutched his ruined face with both hands. He forgot the rifle. He forgot the hunt. The pain blinded him. Eldridge stepped over him. He reversed his grip on the staghorn handle. He drove the blade down. He finished the job with zero hesitation. The fire burned low in the pit. The canyon returned to the sounds of the wind. Eldridge wiped the bloody steel on the dead man's wool coat. He sheathed the knife. He stood in the center of the camp. He surveyed the perimeter. Zero movement in the brush. The horses shifted at the tree, but remained quiet. Eldridge knelt beside the bodies. He checked their pockets. He found spare cartridges and a pouch of tobacco. He left the ammunition and the tobacco. He walked to the horses. 2 heavy canvas canteens hung over the saddle horns. He unbuckled the leather straps. He unscrewed the metal caps. He smelled the contents. Fresh creek water. He screwed the caps back into place. He slung the canteen straps over his shoulder. The sick girl in the wagon required water. The canteens held immense value. He walked back to the fire pit. He kicked loose sand over the red coals. He smothered the embers. Thick gray smoke billowed for a moment, then died. Absolute darkness reclaimed the depression. He took a heavy wool blanket from the first man's saddle. He walked to the edge of the camp. He dropped the blanket onto the dirt. He dragged the heavy wool over the loose shale. He erased his boot prints. He worked his way backward toward the boulders. He swept the ground clean. He smoothed the disturbed earth. He backed into the narrow gap between the rocks. He brushed his tracks away with the blanket. He folded the wool. He tossed it deep into the thorny brush. He turned north. He walked back up the dry riverbed toward the hidden fissure. He carried the water. He carried the silence. He left zero tracks in the canyon dirt. Chapter 10. Dawn brought zero sunlight to the canyon. A wall of brown earth blotted out the sky. Cale Bonner sat on his massive roan stallion. The wind howled through the granite gorge. It carried a thick sheet of pulverized sand and dry topsoil. The dust storm sandblasted the canyon walls. It scoured the rocks. Bonner pulled his heavy buffalo coat tight across his chest. He tied a faded red bandana over his mouth and nose. The grit tasted like crushed chalk. He squinted through the flying dirt. The storm offered zero visibility beyond 30 yards. 8 riders sat their horses behind him. They kept their heads down. The mustangs pinned their ears flat against their skulls. They fought the biting wind. A rider spurred his horse alongside the roan. He pulled his bandana down. He shouted over the roar of the gale. "The picket men missed the sunrise check," the rider said. "We hold 0 word from their camp." "The scavenger cut their throats," Bonner stated. "He moves in the dark. He strikes from the shadows." "The storm erases his wagon tracks," the rider said. "We ride blind." "He drives a broken rig with exhausted animals," Bonner said. "We ride light. We push hard. The storm punishes him more than it punishes us. We ride into the teeth of it." Bonner yanked the reins. He dug his silver spurs into the flanks of the roan stallion. The massive beast surged forward into the brown haze. The 8 riders followed. They vanished into the howling dust. Inside the rock fissure, the wind sounded like a roaring locomotive. Eldridge stepped through the narrow gap. He dropped the 2 heavy canvas canteens in the soft sand. Cora scrambled from the wagon bed. She grabbed a canteen. She unscrewed the metal cap. She rushed to the youngest girl. She tipped the canvas spout. The coughing child drank the cold creek water in greedy gulps. Eldridge stood near the entrance. He watched the brown dust swirl outside the rock walls. The storm swallowed the dry riverbed. "Gather the children," Eldridge said. "We leave the fissure." Cora looked up from the canteen. "The wind tears the skin from the bone. The children lack proper coats. The dust chokes the lungs." "The dust hides the wagon," Eldridge said. "Bonner rides with 9 men. The storm blindfolds them. It offers 0 target practice. We use the cover. We run." Cora nodded. She wrapped the soot-stained shawls over the faces of the orphans. She tied the fabric behind their heads. She created makeshift masks. She climbed onto the driver's bench. She wrapped a piece of torn cotton over her own mouth. Eldridge untied the heavy wool blanket from the mule's head. He threw the fabric into the wagon bed for the children. He took the reins of his bay horse. He swung into the saddle. He rode out of the fissure. The storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind shrieked. The flying sand stung his eyes. It bit his cheeks. He pulled his hat brim low. He buttoned the collar of his canvas duster. He spurred the bay. Cora cracked the leather lines. The mule lunged forward. The buckboard rolled out of the stone gap. The iron wheels ground against the shale. The wind drowned the noise of the creaking wood. Eldridge rode point. He navigated the center of the dry riverbed. He searched for the shapes of the high canyon walls to keep their bearing. The brown haze turned the world into a chaotic blur. The mule lowered its heavy head. It pulled the dead weight into the gale. The 2 mustangs fought the harness. They hated the blowing dirt. Cora used the whip. She kept the team in line. She demanded forward momentum. They pushed through the storm for 2 hours. The terrain grew treacherous. Flash floods from past seasons left deep scars in the canyon floor. The blowing sand filled the hollows. It created flat surfaces over deep drop-offs. Eldridge guided the bay over a smooth patch of earth. The horse stepped light. The hooves found solid rock beneath a thin layer of sand. The wagon followed. The front right iron wheel rolled onto the smooth patch. The heavy rig broke the crust. The ground gave way. A washout trench sat hidden under the dust. The iron wheel slammed down into the rut. It dropped 2 feet. A violent crack split the air. The sound cut through the roar of the wind. The wagon bucked. The rear left wheel lifted off the ground. The entire rig lurched to the right. Cora lost her balance. The jolt pitched her off the wooden bench. She tumbled through the air. She hit the shale shoulder first. She rolled in the dirt. The children screamed in the wagon bed. They smashed against the wooden sideboards. The mule bawled. It dug its hooves into the dirt and dragged the crippled rig forward a foot. The broken wheel locked against the edge of the trench. The wagon stopped dead. It rested at a severe angle. Eldridge hauled the reins. He spun the bay horse. He dropped from the saddle while the animal moved. His boots hit the flying sand. He rushed to Cora. She pushed herself off the ground. She dusted the shale from her torn dress. She gripped her right shoulder. "Zero broken bones," Cora yelled over the wind. Eldridge left her side. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. He crawled under the tilted wagon. The wind whipped the dust into his face. He blinked the grit from his eyes. He read the layout of the undercarriage. The main hickory axle brace hung in jagged splinters. The thick wood snapped in half. The iron axle sagged under the extreme weight of the loaded bed. He crawled out from under the rig. He stood. "The brace failed," Eldridge said. "The wood shattered. The wagon bed rests on the raw iron axle. A mile of rough trail bends the iron. The rig dies." "We hold 0 spare parts," Cora said. Eldridge scanned the perimeter through the brown haze. He spotted a cluster of dead brush near the rock wall. A pale gray stump sat in the center of the thorns. Iron wood. The desert sun baked the moisture from the wood over a decade. It possessed the density of solid iron. He drew his heavy Bowie knife. He walked to the stump. He raised the thick steel blade. He hacked a heavy, straight branch from the dead root system. The wood chipped like stone. He chopped through the fibers. He freed a 2-foot section of the timber. He carried the heavy wood back to the wagon. He crawled underneath the rig. He tested the fit. He slid out. He looked at Cora. He looked at the wagon bed. Thomas stood at the tailgate. The boy held the heavy steel Colt cylinder in his right hand. "Put the iron in your pocket," Eldridge said to the boy. "Get out of the bed." Thomas shoved the cylinder deep into his denim overalls. He climbed over the tailgate. He dropped into the blowing sand. "I need the bed lifted," Eldridge said. "The iron axle holds the entire weight. I need a gap to place the patch. I need clearance." He handed the piece of ironwood to Thomas. "Cora and I lift the bed," Eldridge said. "We hold the strain. You crawl underneath. You jam the timber between the iron axle and the floorboards. You align it straight over the splintered brace." Thomas gripped the rough wood. He dropped to his knees. He braced himself in the dirt. Eldridge walked to the right rear corner of the wagon. He wedged his shoulder under the heavy wooden overhang. "Take the front corner," Eldridge said to Cora. Cora moved to the front right wheel. She wedged her uninjured shoulder under the floorboards. She planted her boots in the loose shale. "Lift on 3, Eldridge said. 1, 2, 3. Eldridge drove his legs upward. He pushed against the sky. The heavy hickory and iron fought him. The weight of the children and the gear pressed down on his spine. His boots slipped in the loose shale. He adjusted his stance. He found traction. He grunted. The muscles in his back burned. Cora strained at the front of the rig. She yelled. She pushed her legs straight. The heavy wagon bed groaned. The rusted nails squealed. The wood lifted off the iron axle. A gap opened. 2 inches of clearance. 3 inches. "Place the timber," Eldridge roared over the wind. Thomas scrambled under the tilted rig. He shoved the ironwood block into the gap. The heavy wood jammed against the iron axle. Thomas hammered the end of the block with the heel of his boot. He forced it deep into the opening. "Clear," Thomas yelled. He rolled out from under the wheels. Eldridge dropped his shoulder. Cora released her grip. The heavy wagon bed slammed down. The floorboards hit the ironwood block with a massive thud. The dead branch held the weight. The bed sat level. The iron axle ran straight. Eldridge unbuckled the leather saddlebags from his bay horse. He pulled a long, thick strip of rawhide from the pouch. He crawled under the wagon. He wrapped the rawhide around the ironwood block and the shattered hickory brace. He bound the pieces together. He pulled the leather. He locked the tension. He tied a series of square knots. The rawhide bit deep into the wood. The patch held rigid. He crawled out into the storm. He dusted his canvas coat. "The rig rolls," Eldridge said. "Get on the bench." Cora climbed back to the driver's seat. Thomas joined the children in the bed. Eldridge mounted the bay. He turned his face into the howling brown wind. He spurred the horse. The patched wagon creaked, but it followed him into the dust. Chapter 11. The brown haze thinned. The wind died. The dust settled back into the earth. The sky cleared. The sun burned through the dirt ceiling. It baked the ground. The wagon rolled out of the dry wash. The terrain flattened. A massive salt flat stretched to the eastern foothills. The ground turned a blinding white. The crusted salt reflected the harsh noon sun. The glare burned the eyes. The ironwood patch held the axle straight. The rawhide bindings stayed rigid. The repair worked, but the wagon moved with a severe limp. The broken wheel dragged in the crust. The mule strained against the heavy leather harness. White foam gathered around the iron bit. Eldridge rode the bay horse on point. He pulled the red bandana from his face. He spat grit onto the white salt. He wiped his jaw. He turned in the saddle. He checked the wagon bed. The children huddled under the soot-stained blankets. They hid from the blinding light. Thomas sat at the tailgate. The boy gripped the heavy steel Colt cylinder in his lap. He stared at the western horizon. Eldridge followed the boy's gaze. The air cleared over the canyon mouth. The dust vanished. A dark line emerged from the stone gap. Men on horses. 9 riders. They formed a wide line. They stopped at the edge of the white salt. The leader rode a massive roan stallion. The beast stood tall against the stark landscape. The man wore a thick buffalo coat. Cale Bonner. He found the trail. He pushed his men through the storm. He closed the gap. Bonner raised a silver-plated rifle. He pointed the barrel at the crippled wagon. The 8 riders beside him kicked their spurs into their mounts. The line surged forward. They broke into a hard gallop. Their horses kicked up plumes of white salt. "They hold our scent," Eldridge said. He turned his head. He scanned the eastern horizon. The salt flat ended 2 miles away. High rocky foothills rose from the desert floor. Thick scrub oak and jagged boulders covered the slopes. A structure sat at the base of the hills. Thick adobe walls formed a square compound. A crumbling bell tower rose from the center. A Spanish mission. Men built it a century ago to convert the desert. Time and heat ruined it. The roof collapsed in sections. The plaster peeled from the mud bricks. The walls offered cover. The compound offered a fortress. Eldridge spurred the bay. He closed the distance to the wagon. He rode alongside the driver's bench. "Look to the foothills," Eldridge said. Cora squinted through the harsh glare. She spotted the adobe walls. "An old church," Cora said. "A bunker," Eldridge said. "The walls take rifle fire. The gate offers a choke point. Drive the rig to the doors." Cora looked back over her shoulder. The line of riders chewed the distance. The drumbeat of 36 galloping hooves vibrated through the white crust. "They hold faster animals," Cora said. "They ride light. We pull dead weight." The distance favors them. They overtake us in a mile. Whip the mule, Eldridge said. Break the beast if you must. Force the rig to the adobe walls. I buy the time. Cora nodded. She stood on the wooden bench. She cracked the heavy leather lines over the mule's back. The animal squealed. It lunged against the harness. The patched wagon lurched forward. The iron rims shattered the salt crust. The rig gained speed. Eldridge hauled the reins. The bay horse stopped. Eldridge spun the animal around. He faced the charging line of riders. He sat in the center of the white plain. The wagon rolled toward the hills. He presented a lone target. He pulled the Springfield .45 to 70 carbine from the scabbard. He rested the heavy steel barrel across his left forearm. He flipped the trapdoor open. He verified the brass cartridge in the chamber. He snapped the breech shut. He thumbed the heavy hammer back to full cock. He read the layout of the charge. The riders maintained a loose formation. Bonner stayed in the center. 4 men flanked him on the left. 4 men flanked him on the right. They fired their rifles from the saddle. Gunsmoke puffed from the charging line. Lead slugs hissed through the air. Bullets struck the salt flat. White powder erupted in geysers around the bay horse. Eldridge ignored the fire. Shooting from a galloping horse yielded 0 accuracy. The men wasted their ammunition. They relied on volume and fear. Eldridge offered 0 fear. He measured the distance. 700 yards. 600. He raised the Springfield to his shoulder. He closed his left eye. He aligned the iron sights. He needed a roadblock. He needed a mass of meat and bone to shatter the charge. He bypassed the riders. A man takes a bullet and falls from the saddle. The horse keeps running. The formation parts and flows around the empty saddle. The pursuit continues. A dead horse creates a wall. 1,000 pounds of falling muscle breaks the momentum. It destroys the riders trailing the animal. He targeted the lead horse on the right flank. A heavy gray gelding. The animal ran a full length in front of the pack. 500 yards. 400. Eldridge held his breath. He settled the front sight post on the center of the gray gelding's chest. He anticipated the rise and fall of the galloping stride. He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. The heavy stock slammed into his shoulder. A cloud of white smoke obscured his vision. The .45 caliber slug crossed the salt flat. It struck the gray gelding dead center in the chest. The heavy lead shattered the breastbone. It penetrated deep into the heart and lungs. The massive animal died on its feet. The gray gelding folded. Its front legs collapsed. Its nose slammed into the crusted salt. The sheer momentum pitched the 1,000-pound carcass into a violent roll. The rider launched from the saddle. He flew through the air. He hit the hard earth. His neck snapped on impact. The dead horse rolled into the path of the riders trailing it. The second horse hit the carcass at a dead sprint. The animal shattered its front legs. It screamed. It cartwheeled over the gray gelding. Its rider crushed his skull against the salt. The third rider panicked. He hauled his reins hard to the left. He avoided the pileup. His horse collided with the rider beside him. Both horses lost their footing. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of screaming animals and broken men. 4 riders down. Half the right flank decimated in 2 seconds. A massive cloud of white dust billowed into the air. It hid the carnage. It blinded the rest of the gang. Bonner hauled back on his massive roan. The remaining riders fought their terrified horses. They pulled their mounts to a sliding halt to avoid the thrashing animals on the ground. The charge broke. The pursuit died in the salt. Eldridge lowered the smoking Springfield. He opened the breech. He extracted the hot brass casing. He jammed a fresh cartridge into the chamber. He locked the trapdoor. He looked over his shoulder. The wagon reached the edge of the foothills. It rolled toward the adobe walls of the mission. He bought the time. Eldridge turned the bay horse. He spurred the animal into a hard run. He rode for the sanctuary of the crumbling stones. Chapter 12. Eldridge pushed the bay horse to the limit. The animal lathered with thick sweat. The lungs burned. The hooves pounded the loose dirt leading away from the salt flat. The adobe mission sat on a slight rise at the base of the rocky foothills. A 5-foot wall enclosed a square courtyard. The mud bricks crumbled in sections. A massive set of heavy wooden gates guarded the front entrance. The right door hung loose on rusted iron hinges. The left door stood shut. The wagon cleared the gates. The iron wheels skidded to a halt in the dry dust of the courtyard. The mule stood chest-deep in the dirt. The animal dropped its heavy head. The Mustang stood trembling in the harness. They possessed zero forward momentum. Eldridge rode through the gateway. He slid from the saddle while the horse moved. His boots hit the dirt. "Get the children from the bed," Eldridge roared. "Move them to the bell tower." Cora dropped the heavy leather driving lines. She scrambled over the buckboard bench. She jumped into the wagon bed. She grabbed the 2 youngest girls. She hoisted them over the wooden side panel. They hit the dirt. Thomas jumped down. He caught his younger brother. He directed the children toward the crumbling sanctuary in the center of the courtyard. Eldridge ran to the heavy wooden gates. He grabbed the edge of the loose right door. He dug his boots into the dust. He used the strength in his back and his legs. He heaved the heavy timber structure. The rusted iron hinges squealed in protest. The door moved. It ground against the dirt. Eldridge threw his shoulder into the wood. The heavy gate slammed shut against the left door. The iron latch bracket aligned. Eldridge scanned the courtyard. He spotted a thick, weathered cedar beam lying near a collapsed horse trough. He sprinted to the wood. He grabbed the beam. He hauled it to the gates. He dropped the heavy cedar into the iron brackets. The lock held. The beam barred the doors. The entrance offered zero access. He walked away from the gates. He checked the perimeter of the compound. The square walls offered a solid defense from a ground assault. The mud bricks stood 2 feet thick. They absorbed lead. The height prevented a man from jumping the barricade from a standing start. The design held a massive flaw. The rear of the mission backed up to the steep, rocky foothills. The terrain rose high above the adobe walls. A rifleman on the ridge held a clear sight line into the center of the courtyard. He held the angle. He possessed the elevation. The courtyard offered a box with zero cover from above. Eldridge walked to the center of the compound. The main chapel stood as a ruin. Fire took the roof a decade ago. The blackened crossbeams hung over the sanctuary floor like charred ribs. The plaster peeled from the mud walls. A square bell tower rose from the front corner of the chapel. The structure stood 30 feet high. The thick adobe walls remained intact. The narrow windows offered firing slits. The tower presented the only defensible position in the compound. Cora stood at the base of the tower. She pushed the children through a low-arched doorway. The orphans vanished into the dark interior. "The tower holds stone stairs," Cora said. "They lead to the belfry." "Take them to the top," Eldridge said. "Keep them below the window ledges. Tell them to cover their ears. The noise will shatter their senses." "What of the wagon?" Cora asked. "The animals provide cover in the courtyard," Eldridge said. The wagon blocks the line of sight to the chapel doors. Leave them. Eldridge walked to the bay horse. He pulled the Springfield from the scabbard. He opened his canvas coat. He checked the leather bandolier. He extracted a handful of the heavy brass cartridges. He shoved the ammunition deep into the right pocket of his duster. He patted his right hip. The Colt Peacemaker sat secure in the holster. He unhooked the rawhide loop from the hammer. He heard the deep rumble of horses. The sound vibrated through the dry earth. The noise amplified. It rolled over the top of the adobe walls. The hunting party arrived at the edge of the foothills. "Go," Eldridge said. Cora turned. She stepped through the arched doorway of the tower. She disappeared into the dark. Eldridge moved toward the chapel ruins. He bypassed the main entrance. He walked to the side of the structure. He found a section where the adobe wall collapsed. The mud bricks formed a crude staircase of rubble. He slung the Springfield over his shoulder. He climbed the rubble. He scaled the broken wall. He reached the top of the structure. He stood on the flat section of the surviving roof. A low parapet surrounded the edge. He crouched behind the mud barrier. He read the layout of the terrain outside the compound. Cale Bonner and 4 riders sat their horses 100 yards from the main gates. The dust settled around the animals. The men held their rifles. They stared at the closed timber doors. They stared at the crumbling adobe walls. They recognized the fortification. They understood the cost of a direct assault. Bonner spurred his massive roan stallion. He rode forward at a slow walk. He stopped 50 yards from the gates. He raised a hand. The 4 riders split. 2 rode hard to the left. 2 rode hard to the right. They circled the perimeter. They established a loose perimeter. They searched for a weak point. They looked for an open window or a collapsed rear wall. They found solid mud and stone. The mission offered 0 back doors. Bonner sat alone in front of the gates. The sun beat down on his heavy buffalo coat. He rested the silver-plated, repeating rifle across his saddle horn. He chewed the end of a dark cigar. He spat a stream of brown juice onto the white dust. He stared at the bell tower. He stared at the flat roof of the chapel. Eldridge lay flat on his stomach behind the parapet. He rested the heavy steel barrel of the Springfield on top of the mud wall. He clicked the hammer back to full cock. He aligned the iron sights. He settled the front post on the center of the buffalo coat. He held the advantage. A single shot ended the pursuit. A single bullet shattered the leadership. He took a slow breath. He steadied his finger on the trigger. "I see the gun barrel," Bonner shouted. His voice boomed across the flat ground. It echoed off the rocky foothills. "I know you hear me," Bonner roared. "I offer a parley. One man to another. I offer a transaction." Eldridge held his breath. He kept the sights locked on Bonner's chest. He offered 0 response. He waited for the man to talk. "You hold a dead hand," Bonner yelled. "You sit in a stone box. You hold 0 water. You hold exhausted animals. I hold the high ground. I hold time. We starve you out in 3 days." Bonner shifted in the saddle. He raised a hand. He pointed at the ruined town of Silver Drift to the north. "The woman means nothing to me," Bonner said. "The children mean less. They hold 0 value. The silver sits heavy in my saddlebags. I hold enough wealth to buy a territory." Bonner lowered his hand. He looked straight at the chapel roof. "I offer a trade," Bonner said. "You open the gates. You saddle your bay horse. You ride out. You ride north. You ride south. I care 0 about your direction. You leave the woman. You leave the orphans. I hand you a leather sack filled with pure silver ingots. A heavy sack. Enough silver to buy 10 horses. Enough silver to forget the faces in that tower. Eldridge stared through the iron sights. He listened to the words. He read the tactic. Bonner presented a logical argument to a mercenary. He offered a clear path to survival and profit. He relied on greed to break the defense. You walk away rich, Bonner shouted. They stay here. The ledger balances. Eldridge tightened his grip on the heavy wooden stock. He read his own ledger. The silver held value. The orphans held zero monetary worth. A pragmatist accepts the silver. A pragmatist rides away. Eldridge operated by a different code. He made a promise in the crawlspace. He committed to the transport. He took the job. He never abandoned a contract. He never sold his word for silver. You hold 5 seconds to answer, Bonner yelled. 5 seconds to claim the wealth. Then the lead flies. 1. Eldridge adjusted the elevation of the rear sight. 2. Eldridge steadied his breathing. 3. Eldridge squeezed the trigger. Chapter 13. The Springfield roared. A massive plume of white gun smoke erupted from the heavy steel muzzle. The recoil slammed into Eldridge's right shoulder. The .45 to 70 slug crossed the 50 yards of open dirt. It missed the center of Cale Bonner's chest. Eldridge dropped the muzzle a fraction of an inch before the sear broke. The heavy lead bullet struck the crusted earth dead center between the front hooves of the roan stallion. The impact created a geyser of white dust and fractured rock. The stallion shrieked. The massive beast reared back on its hind legs. It punched the air with its iron shoes. It fought the heavy silver bit. Bonner lost his stirrups. He dropped his silver-plated Winchester to the end of its leather saddle tether. He grabbed the saddle horn with both hands. He fought to keep his seat. He cursed the horse. He wrestled the terrified animal back to the ground. Eldridge stood up behind the low adobe parapet. He exposed his head and chest to the canyon. The gray smoke drifted around his canvas coat. I take 0 deals, Eldridge roared over the ringing echo of the gunshot. I hold the contract. Bonner secured his reins. He hauled the roan in a tight circle. He grabbed the silver Winchester. His face turned a dark, violent red. Tear the mud down, Bonner screamed at his men. Turn him to meat. The 4 riders spurred their horses. They scattered. They broke their tight formation. They sought cover behind the sparse scrub oak and the jagged boulders dotting the edge of the foothills. They leveled their repeating rifles. The gang opened fire. A wall of lead struck the front of the mission. The air filled with the hiss of passing bullets and the sharp cracks of supersonic impacts. Eldridge dropped flat on his stomach. He pressed his face into the rough clay of the roof. Bullets chewed the top of the parapet. Chunks of dried mud exploded. Shrapnel rained down on Eldridge's back. A slug punched a hole straight through the 2-foot adobe barrier. It whined over his head and struck the charred crossbeams of the chapel interior. Dust blinded him. The smell of pulverized earth mixed with the sharp tang of sulfur. The volume of fire overwhelmed the senses. 5 lever-action rifles working in unison created a continuous rolling thunder. They meant to suppress the roof. They meant to pin him to the floorboards. Eldridge refused to stay pinned. A static target dies. He cradled the Springfield in his arms. He crawled 10 feet to the right. He dragged his belt buckle across the harsh clay. The parapet absorbed a dozen impacts where his head rested 3 seconds prior. He reached a section of the wall reinforced by a thick wooden support beam. He flipped the trapdoor breech of the Springfield open. The hot brass casing ejected. It burned his wrist. He ignored the sting. He reached into the right pocket of his duster. He pulled a fresh paper-patched cartridge. He shoved the brass into the chamber. He snapped the breech shut. He thumbed the hammer back. He rose to his knees. He popped his head and shoulders over the parapet. He read the layout of the canyon through the smoke and dust. He spotted a bandit in a faded brown duster kneeling behind a dead mesquite bush. The man worked the lever of his Winchester. Eldridge aligned the front sight post. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle boomed. The slug tore through the dry mesquite wood. It struck the bandit's rifle stock. The impact shattered the wood into 100 splinters. It tore the weapon from the man's hands. The bandit screamed. He fell backward into the dirt. He clutched his hands to his chest. Eldridge dropped behind the mud wall. 3 seconds later, concentrated fire hammered his new position. The adobe cracked and groaned under the punishment. Eldridge rolled onto his back. He pushed himself along the roof with his boots. He scrambled 15 feet to the left corner of the chapel. He left a trail of disturbed dust. He reached the edge. He reloaded the Springfield on his back. The heavy brass clicked into the chamber. He rolled onto his stomach. He popped up over the left edge. A bandit crouched behind a low limestone rock. The man fired blindly at the center of the roof. Eldridge aimed low. He fired. The bullet struck the top of the limestone rock. It shattered the stone. Jagged rock fragments exploded into the bandit's face. The man dropped his rifle. He covered his eyes. He rolled away from the cover. He thrashed in the open dirt. Eldridge vanished behind the wall. He moved again. He crawled back to the center. He established a rhythm. Fire, drop, move, reload, fire. He never shot from the same location twice. He manipulated their perception. He made the heavy single-shot rifle sound like 3 men returning fire from different angles. He forced the bandits to guess. He forced them to respect the roof. Bonner sat behind a massive granite boulder near the trail. He ceased firing. He watched the roof. He tracked the puffs of white smoke. He realized the futility of the tactic. They wasted expensive ammunition on thick dirt. Bonner shifted his gaze. He looked past the chapel roof. He stared at the square bell tower rising 30 feet into the air. "The tower," Bonner yelled. His voice cut through the gunfire. "Shoot the stone. Put the fear in the woman." The 3 remaining able-bodied bandits adjusted their aim. They elevated their rifle barrels. They ignored the chapel roof. They targeted the belfry. Lead slammed into the heavy fieldstone of the tower. The impacts rang like a dozen iron hammers striking anvils. Bullets flew through the narrow arched windows. They ricocheted off the interior walls. The noise inside the confined space offered pure torment. Eldridge heard a scream. A child's voice pierced the gunfire. It drifted down from the high window. He clenched his jaw. He gripped the wooden stock of the Springfield. He needed to draw the aggression back to the roof. He needed to present a target they could not ignore. He opened the breech. He loaded a fresh round. He checked his pocket. 3 loose cartridges remained. He stood up. He abandoned the cover of the parapet. He walked to the center of the flat roof. He stood at his full height. He offered his chest to the canyon. He raised the Springfield to his shoulder. He took a slow breath. He blocked the noise. He blocked the flying mud. He focused on a bandit standing near a cluster of scrub oak. The man poured fire into the bell tower. Eldridge squeezed the trigger. The bullet crossed the distance. It struck the bandit in the right thigh. The heavy lead shattered the femur. The man collapsed like a dropped puppet. He hit the dirt. He howled in agony. He grabbed his ruined leg. The remaining men turned their rifles away from the tower. They saw the tall man standing in the open on the chapel roof. They aimed. Eldridge dropped. A dozen bullets sliced the air where his chest existed a second prior. He hit the clay roof hard. He rolled toward the parapet. He pressed his back against the thick mud bricks. The gang punished the roof again. They emptied their magazines. They fired until the firing pins clicked on empty chambers. The gunfire stopped. A heavy, ringing silence settled over the mission. The smell of cordite hung thick in the stagnant air. Dust drifted down like gray snow. Eldridge stayed flat. He cracked the trapdoor of the Springfield. He extracted the empty brass. He loaded one of his final 3 rounds. He closed the breech. He listened to the desert. He heard men shouting in the distance. He heard the sound of horses moving backward. The gang retreated out of range. Eldridge crawled to the edge of the parapet. He peeked through a V-shaped crack in the adobe. Bonner sat on his roan stallion, 100 yards away. 2 men sat saddle-weary on their mounts. The other 2 men lay in the dirt, tending their wounds. They stared at the solid wooden gates. They stared at the high adobe walls. A direct assault carried a brutal cost. Bonner possessed a predator's instinct. Predators avoid a frontal attack against fortified prey. They look for the blind spot. They search for the soft underbelly. Eldridge turned his head. He looked at the rear of the courtyard. The high adobe walls backed up directly against the steep, rocky foothills. Shadows gathered deep in the terrain above the mission. He knew the silence offered zero safety. Bonner plotted the next move. Bonner evaluated the rear wall. Chapter 14. Hemp rope scraped against sun-baked adobe. The sound drifted over the main chapel roof. It carried over the sharp cracks of the rifle fire from the front gates. Bonner used the barrage to mask the maneuver. He threw a wall of lead at the parapet to pin the defense. He sent a flanking element to the rear of the compound. He found the blind spot. Eldridge lay flat on the clay tiles. He listened past the gunfire. He focused on the rear courtyard. He heard the tension of the heavy rope against the mud bricks. He heard the shift of loose dirt. 2 dull thuds hit the hard earth. Boots in the dust. 2 men cleared the rear wall. They stood inside the perimeter. Eldridge abandoned his position at the front parapet. He crawled backward across the flat roof. He ignored the bullets chewing the clay barrier behind him. He reached the center of the structure. The fire from a decade ago consumed the main crossbeams. The blaze burned a massive, jagged hole in the roof above the sanctuary. The skylight offered a 10-foot drop to the flagstones below. Eldridge slung the Springfield carbine over his right shoulder. The long barrel offered zero use in a close-quarters struggle. He needed the short iron. He needed the speed. He slid his legs over the jagged edge of the opening. He gripped the charred timber framing. He lowered his body into the void. He hung by his fingers for a single second. He dropped into the shadows. His boots struck the stone floor. He bent his knees to absorb the shock. Dust plumed around his ankles. He unhooked the rawhide loop on his holster. He drew the Colt Peacemaker. He cocked the hammer on the draw. The metallic click snapped in the quiet sanctuary. The chapel interior sat deep in gloom. Light filtered through the narrow windows and the hole in the roof. The air smelled of old ash and damp earth. Charred wooden pews lined the center aisle. A heavy oak door stood at the back of the room. It connected the sanctuary to the rear courtyard. The iron latch lifted. The heavy door swung inward. Harsh daylight spilled into the dust. Two men stepped through the frame. They wore dark canvas dusters and leather riding chaps. They held lever-action Winchesters at the ready. They expected an empty room. They expected to find a staircase or a ladder to the roof. They planned to shoot the defender in the back. Eldridge stood in the center aisle. He leveled the heavy steel barrel of the Colt. The lead bandit spotted the movement. His eyes went wide. He tried to swing his rifle barrel up from his hip. He needed a half-second to align the shot. Eldridge offered 0 time. He squeezed the trigger. The .45 caliber gun fired. The noise inside the stone walls delivered pure concussion. The flash illuminated the dark corners of the chapel. The sound battered the eardrums. The heavy lead slug struck the lead bandit in the stomach. A gut shot breaks a man in half. It destroys the core balance. The impact folded the bandit forward. The rifle slipped from his hands. He grabbed his stomach. He fell to his knees on the stone flagstones. He released a wet, ragged gasp. He tipped sideways and hit the floor. The second bandit reacted to the blast. He saw the gun flash. He held 0 space to aim his Winchester. He dropped the long weapon. He lowered his right shoulder. He charged. He crossed the 10 feet of stone floor before Eldridge could cock the Colt a second time. The man slammed into Eldridge's chest like a runaway freight car. The impact drove the air from Eldridge's lungs. The force lifted him off his boots. He traveled backward through the air. He crashed into a row of charred pews. The brittle wood shattered under their combined weight. Splinters tore through Eldridge's canvas coat. They hit the stone floor in a tangle of limbs. The bandit landed on top. The man carried heavy muscle and pure desperation. He smelled of stale sweat and cheap chewing tobacco. The Colt peacemaker spun out of Eldridge's right hand. The gun skittered across the flagstones. It stopped out of reach under a broken bench. The bandit pinned Eldridge's left arm to the floor with his knee. He brought his hands up. He curled his fingers into claws. He drove his thumbs toward Eldridge's eyes. The man meant to blind him. He meant to gouge the eyes straight from the sockets. He jammed his weight forward to drive the thumbs deep. Eldridge snapped his face to the right. The bandit's left thumb missed the eye socket. It hooked inside Eldridge's mouth. The man hooked the cheek. He tore at the flesh. His right thumb found the corner of Eldridge's left eye. Pressure built against the eyeball. White flashes exploded in Eldridge's vision. Pain radiated through his skull. He needed to break the hold. He required a lethal counter. He needed the steel. His right hand remained free. He reached across his stomach. He felt the staghorn handle of the Bowie knife in the cross-draw sheath. He gripped the textured bone. He pulled the thick steel free. The confined space restricted his swing. He held 0 room for a slash. The bandit pressed his chest tight against Eldridge's ribs. Eldridge needed a direct puncture. He turned the blade edge toward himself. He braced the flat of the brass crossguard against the heel of his palm. He drove his right arm upward. The heavy steel tip caught the bandit right below the rib cage. Eldridge drove his hips off the floor. He put the strength of his shoulder and his back into the thrust. The thick blade punched through the bandit's canvas duster. It pierced the stomach muscle. It slid under the rib cage. It drove deep into the chest cavity. The steel scraped bone. It punctured the lung. The bandit went rigid. His thumbs released their crushing grip on Eldridge's face. The man gasped. The air rushed out of his torn lung. Blood bubbled over his lips and spilled onto Eldridge's collar. His eyes rolled back into his head. Eldridge twisted the staghorn handle. The wide blade destroyed the internal organs. The bandit's weight turned dead. The tension left his muscles. He collapsed face first onto Eldridge's chest. Eldridge shoved the corpse away. He ripped the Bowie knife from the ribs. Blood soaked his right sleeve. He rolled the dead man onto the shattered remains of the pews. He sat up on the stone floor. He breathed heavy. The canyon air burned his lungs. He tasted copper in his mouth from the torn cheek. He touched his face. His fingers came away slick with his own blood. He wiped his hand on his canvas coat. He stood up. The stone floor offered solid footing. He walked to the shadows under the bench. He picked up the Colt Peacemaker. He thumbed the hammer back. He checked the cylinder. He holstered the weapon. He wiped the bloody Bowie knife on the dead man's coat. He sheathed the blade. He walked to the first bandit. The gut-shot man lay dead in a growing pool of dark blood. Eldridge walked to the heavy oak door. He closed it. He slid the rusted iron bolt into the bracket. He barred the rear entrance. He stood in the center of the ruined chapel. He looked up at the jagged hole in the roof. The sky above lost its harsh blue glare. It turned the color of a bruised plum. The sun dropped behind the high western peaks. Shadows pooled thick in the corners of the sanctuary. The temperature in the stone room plummeted. Night claimed the desert. The darkness offered a new battlefield. Bonner held the numbers. Bonner held the perimeter. The rifles ceased firing at the front gates. The silence returned, heavy and waiting. Eldridge unslung the Springfield carbine. He checked the brass cartridge in the breech. He snapped the trapdoor shut. He prepared for the dark. Chapter 15. A sulfur match flared in the black desert night. Cale Bonner held the small flame. He cupped it in his leather-gloved hands to block the wind. He touched the fire to a thick piece of dried chala cactus wrapped in a torn canvas flour sack. He soaked the canvas in kerosene from his saddle supplies. The rag ignited with a deep whoosh. Bright orange fire pushed the shadows back. Bonner handed the torch to a rider on his left. The man held the burning wood high. "Make another," Bonner said. 4 riders stood in the scrub brush 50 yards from the rear wall of the mission. They tied dry sage and dead mesquite branches into thick bundles. They drenched the bundles in the remaining kerosene. They struck matches. They built a dozen heavy torches. The flames crackled. Black smoke coiled into the cold air. Bonner stared at the dark shape of the mission. The stone box cost him men. The tall man inside possessed severe, lethal skill. A direct assault meant more dead riders. Bonner held zero interest in a fair fight. He wanted the silver secured. He wanted the witnesses erased. "He holds the angles in the light," Bonner said. "He owns the dark inside those walls. We take the dark away. We build an oven." Bonner drew his silver-plated Winchester. He pointed the barrel at the high adobe walls. "Throw the fire," Bonner said. "Burn the mud. Burn the meat." The 4 men stepped forward. They hurled the heavy torches through the air. The burning bundles arched over the desert brush. They sailed over the rear and side walls of the compound. They dropped into the courtyard. Eldridge sat on the cold stone steps of the bell tower. He wiped the dried blood from his hands with a piece of burlap. The smell of the dead bandits in the chapel lingered on his canvas coat. Total darkness claimed the interior of the tower. He heard the ragged breathing of the youngest girl on the landing above. The cold bit into his bones. The stone trapped the freezing desert air. A dull thump sounded in the courtyard. Wood hit hard dirt. Another thump followed. A third. An orange glow bled through the narrow arched doorway at the base of the tower. The light flickered. It danced against the interior stone. Eldridge dropped the burlap. He stood. He gripped the Springfield carbine. He descended the 3 steps to the ground floor. He stepped to the edge of the arched doorway. He looked into the open compound. 6 burning torches lay scattered across the white dust. The kerosene fueled the flames. They burned bright and hot. A 7th torch sailed over the east wall. It arced through the night sky. It bypassed the dirt. It landed on the collapsed roof of the old stables bordering the right flank of the courtyard. The stable roof consisted of rotted cedar beams and decades of dead brittle brush. The desert sun baked all moisture from the organic material. It sat like absolute tinder. The kerosene torch hit the brush. The roof exploded. Fire leapt across the dry wood. The flames devoured the dead sage. A wall of bright orange heat erupted. It climbed 10 feet into the air. The crackle of burning timber drowned out the wind. Another torch cleared the wall. It struck the remnants of a wooden corral attached to the stables. The dry fence posts caught fire. Eldridge stepped out of the doorway. He felt the intense heat on his face. The fire created its own wind. It sucked the cold air from the courtyard and fed the blaze. The flames jumped from the stables to the side of the chapel. They licked the old, dried plaster. The heat blistered the paint on the heavy wooden main gates. Thick, oily black smoke poured from the burning roof. The high adobe walls of the compound blocked the desert breeze. The walls trapped the smoke. The courtyard functioned as a massive stone chimney. The smoke pooled in the center of the yard. It thickened into a dark fog. It banked against the walls and rose toward the chapel ruins. The animals panicked. The 2 captured mustangs tied near the center of the yard fought their leather tethers. They reared on their hind legs. They struck the air with their iron shoes. Their eyes rolled white in their skulls. The flames terrified them. The brown mule bawled. It threw its heavy head side to side. It kicked the dirt. It strained against the harness connected to the buckboard wagon. Eldridge ran into the courtyard. He kept his head low to avoid the thickest part of the smoke layer. He reached the bay horse. The animal pulled against the hitching post. Eldridge grabbed the leather halter. He stroked the horse's neck. He applied heavy downward pressure. He forced the animal to ground all 4 hooves. He looked at the wagon. The rig sat 15 feet from the burning corral. Sparks showered the air. Glowing red embers drifted on the heat thermals. They landed on the wagon bed. They landed on the wooden bench. He slapped the sparks from the wood with his gloved hands. He required the wagon intact. The rig offered their only transport. He left the wagon. He ran back to the bell tower. He plunged through the arched doorway. The smoke followed him. The dark cloud drafted into the structure. It curled up the stone staircase. Eldridge took the steps 2 at a time. He reached the first landing. Cora knelt on the stone floor. She held the youngest girl tight against her chest. The other 5 children pressed their backs against the cold wall. They held their hands over their mouths and noses. The smoke filled the confined space. It burned the eyes. It tore at the throat. The youngest girl coughed. The sound ripped through her damaged lungs. She gasped for air. She inhaled thick black soot. Her small body convulsed. Thomas stood near the narrow window slit. He looked out at the burning courtyard. The orange light illuminated his soot-stained face. He gripped the heavy steel Colt cylinder in his right hand. "The yard burns," Thomas said. "The fire eats the wood." Eldridge looked at Cora. Her eyes streamed with water. She coughed. "The smoke rises," Eldridge said. "The tower acts as a flue. The heat pushes the soot straight up the stone stairs. The air turns to poison." "We move to the belfry," Cora said. "We seek the open windows at the top." The top traps the heat, Eldridge said. The fire bakes the stone. The tower turns into a kiln. The smoke thickens at the ceiling. You suffocate before the flames reach the wood. A massive crash shook the compound. Eldridge looked through the narrow window slit. The burning roof of the stables collapsed. Heavy flaming timbers slammed into the dirt. A geyser of sparks and ash shot 50 feet into the night sky. The fire spread to the scrub grass bordering the chapel walls. The flames surrounded the main sanctuary. The roof in the chapel holds dry crossbeams, Eldridge said. The embers will catch the wood. The sanctuary falls next. Cora stood. She pulled the coughing girl up with her. She looked around the small stone landing. We hold 0 safe rooms, Cora said. The walls box us in. Bonner changed the layout, Eldridge said. He refuses to breach the gate. He plans to sit outside the walls. He waits for the fire to finish the job. Eldridge read the tactical reality of the courtyard. The mission offered a solid defense against bullets. It offered a tomb against fire. The adobe walls held the heat. The compound offered 0 escape routes except the front doors. He looked at the heavy wooden gates through the window slit. The fire illuminated the rusted iron brackets and the thick cedar beam locking the entrance. The walls come down, Eldridge said. The compound offers 0 protection. We stay, we burn. We stay, we choke on the black air. Cora wiped her eyes. She looked at the flames reflecting on the stone walls. She looked at Eldridge. We take the wagon, Eldridge said. We load the children. We break out. Chapter 16. Eldridge grabbed the 2 canvas canteens from his saddle horn. He unscrewed the metal caps. The heat in the courtyard baked the moisture from the air. The flames devoured the dry cedar of the stables. The fire crawled up the side of the chapel wall. The smoke banked against the adobe and rolled in a thick choking cloud. He ran to the center of the yard. The brown mule strained against the heavy leather harness. The beast threw its heavy head. White foam gathered around the iron bit. The 2 mustangs reared on their hind legs. The fire terrified the animals. They offered 0 obedience. They wanted to run from the heat. Eldridge reached the buckboard. He snatched a thick burlap sack from the wooden bench. He drew his heavy bowie knife. He sliced the coarse fabric into wide strips. He dumped the creek water from the canteens over the burlap. The water soaked into the fibers. He moved to the mule. The animal snapped its flat teeth. It kicked its hind legs at the buckboard splashboard. Eldridge ignored the hooves. He lunged forward. He clamped his left hand over the mule's snout. He applied crushing pressure. He dragged the beast's head down. The mule fought the grip. Eldridge held firm. He slapped the wet burlap over the animal's eyes. He tied the ends under the jaw. He pulled the knot tight. The wet fabric extinguished the glare of the flames. It cooled the mule's skin. Total darkness erased the visual terror. The beast stopped kicking. It stood trembling in the dust. Eldridge moved to the mustangs. He repeated the process. He fought the thrashing heads. He bound their eyes in wet darkness. The 3-animal team went rigid. They stood blind in the center of the inferno. He turned to Cora. She stood near the wagon wheel. The 6 children clustered around her skirts. They hacked and wheezed. The youngest girl gasped for every breath. Load the bed, Eldridge roared over the roar of the fire. Cora grabbed the children. She hoisted them over the wooden side panel. They tumbled onto the floorboards. Thomas climbed over the tailgate last. The boy gripped the heavy steel Colt cylinder in his right hand. Eldridge stepped to the side of the wagon. He looked down at the orphans. Press your faces into the floorboards, Eldridge said. The wood absorbs the lead. Keep your heads below the side panels. You sit up, you die. You make a sound, you die. I offer 0-second chances on this rule. Thomas pushed the youngest girl flat against the wood. He lay beside her. He looked up at Eldridge. We hold the floor, Thomas said. Eldridge looked at Cora. She climbed onto the driver's bench. She gathered the heavy leather lines in her scarred hands. She stared at the closed wooden gates. The animals hold zero sight, Eldridge said. They rely on the whip. You must drive them blind through the fire. You must force them into the wood. Open the gate, Cora said. Eldridge left the wagon. He ran toward the front entrance. The air nearest the walls burned the lungs. The fire stripped the oxygen from the courtyard. He reached the heavy wooden doors. The thick cedar beam sat in the rusted iron brackets. It locked the compound tight. He looked back at the burning stables. A massive roof support timber lay in the dirt. The wood burned bright orange. Flames licked the center of the log. Eldridge ran to the fire. He grabbed the unburned end of the thick timber with his gloved hands. The heat blistered the leather against his palms. He dragged the heavy, flaming log across the dirt. He hauled it toward the main gates. He read the layout of the night outside. Bonner and his men sat in the total dark. Their eyes adjusted to the black desert. They waited for the fire to flush their prey. Eldridge dragged the burning log to the center seam of the double doors. He kicked the timber. He jammed it against the base of the wood. The flames flared. He reached for the heavy cedar locking beam. He wedged his shoulder under the wood. He drove his legs up. He lifted the heavy timber from the iron brackets. He threw the beam into the dirt. The gates stood unbarred. Eldridge stepped back. He drew the Springfield carbine from his shoulder sling. He thumbed the heavy hammer back to full cock. He looked at Cora on the wagon bench. He nodded. Eldridge kicked the right gate door. He put the strength of his leg into the strike. The rusted iron hinges squealed. The heavy wood swung outward. A massive draft of cold desert air rushed into the courtyard. The sudden oxygen fed the blaze. The fire roared. The rush of air grabbed the thick black smoke trapped in the compound. It sucked the smoke through the open gate. A dense, oily fog rolled out into the desert night. Eldridge kicked the burning timber through the gap. The flaming log tumbled out of the courtyard. It rested in the white dust 10 feet beyond the gates. The sudden burst of bright orange fire shattered the night. The glare hit the dark-adjusted eyes of the bandits waiting in the scrub. It blinded them. The rolling smoke provided a thick, chaotic screen. "Drive the beast," Eldridge roared. Cora stood on the buckboard. She swung the heavy leather lines. She cracked the leather across the mule's back. "Ha!" Cora screamed. She whipped the blind mustangs. The leather bit into their flanks. The pain broke their stasis. The mule lunged. The mustangs charged. The heavy iron wheels ground against the dirt. The wagon exploded forward. The blind animals ran from the pain of the whip. They charged straight toward the open gates. The buckboard smashed through the billowing smoke. It cleared the high adobe walls. The iron wheels rattled over the hard desert pan. Eldridge spun away from the gates. He ran to the bay horse. The animal hated the fire, but it trusted the man. Eldridge grabbed the saddle horn. He swung his leg over the leather. He spurred the horse into a hard gallop. He charged through the gates right behind the wagon. He cleared the smoke screen. He hit the cold night air. The glare of the burning timber illuminated the scrub brush. He spotted a bandit. The man sat on a dark horse 30 yards to the left. The man rubbed his eyes. The sudden fire blinded him. He aimed his Winchester blind into the smoke. Eldridge guided the bay with his knees. He raised the Springfield carbine. He brought the heavy wooden stock to his shoulder. He aimed on the move. He pulled the trigger. The .45 to 70 roared. The recoil slammed his shoulder. A massive plume of white smoke erupted from the muzzle. The heavy slug struck the blinded bandit in the right shoulder. The impact shattered the collarbone. It tore the arm from the socket. The man flew backward out of his saddle. He hit the scrub brush. His horse bolted into the dark. Eldridge flipped the trapdoor breech open. The hot brass casing ejected. It burned a line across his canvas sleeve. He reached into his pocket. He jammed a fresh cartridge into the chamber. He snapped the breech shut. He cocked the hammer. Gunfire erupted from the right flank. The remaining bandits fired wild into the smoke screen. Lead hissed past Eldridge's head. A bullet struck the dirt near the bay's front hooves. The men shot at the sound of the rattling wagon wheels. They shot at shadows. Eldridge lowered his head. He spurred the bay. He rode hard after the wagon. The rig bumped and crashed over the uneven desert floor. The blind animals ran on pure terror and muscle. Cora fought the lines to keep them straight. A voice boomed across the desert. "Mount up," Bonner roared. "Run them down." Eldridge looked back over his shoulder. The flames from the mission illuminated the desert. Cale Bonner sat astride his massive roan stallion. The man wore the heavy buffalo coat. He held the silver-plated, repeating rifle high in the air. Bonner spurred the roan. The massive beast surged forward. The 4 remaining bandits whipped their horses. They broke from the scrub brush. They cleared their eyes. They found the trail. Chapter 17. Iron rims hammered the hard desert pan. The buckboard crashed through the dry scrub brush. The heavy wooden frame groaned under the punishment. Cora swung the thick leather driving lines. She whipped the team with zero mercy. The brown mule and the 2 mustangs ran blind. The wet burlap over their eyes held them in total darkness. They ran from the sharp bite of the leather. They ran from the roar of the mission fire fading behind them. Eldridge rode the bay horse 10 yards behind the tailgate. He acted as the rear guard. He held the Springfield carbine in his right hand. The cold night wind tore at his canvas coat. He tracked the muzzle flashes in the dark. Bonner and his 4 remaining riders closed the gap. They rode fresh, unburdened animals. The wagon pulled absolute dead weight. The distance vanished with every passing second. Lead hissed through the air. A bullet struck the heavy hickory tailgate of the buckboard. Wood splinters showered the wagon bed. The orphans screamed. Thomas pushed his younger sisters flat against the floorboards. He covered their bodies with his own. Eldridge twisted in the saddle. He raised the Springfield. He fired blind at the muzzle flashes. The heavy recoil punched his shoulder. White gun smoke blinded him for a single second. He held zero expectations of a hit. He wanted to force the riders to dodge. He wanted to break their rhythm. He flipped the trapdoor open. He caught the hot brass casing. He tossed it into the dirt. He jammed his second-to-last paper-patched cartridge into the chamber. He snapped the breech shut. Bonner roared a command. His voice carried over the pounding hooves. 2 riders broke from the main pursuit. They spurred their horses left and right. They flanked the wagon. They utilized the open desert to surround the rig. The rider on the right flank pushed his horse hard. The animal lathered with sweat. The bandit pulled even with the rear wheels of the buckboard. He ignored Eldridge. He targeted the driver's bench. He wanted to kill the woman. He wanted to stop the rig. The bandit raised a double-barrel shotgun. The short steel barrels caught the faint starlight. A spread of heavy buckshot at 10 feet guaranteed a slaughter. It guaranteed a dead woman and crippled animals. Eldridge shoved the Springfield into the saddle scabbard. He drew the Colt peacemaker. He cocked the hammer. He dug his spurs into the bay. He needed to close the gap. The bandit held the angle. Eldridge held 0 clear shots. The high wooden sideboards of the wagon blocked his line of sight to the man's chest. "Cora, drop!" Eldridge roared over the grinding wheels. Cora heard the shout. She fell forward. She pressed her face against the wooden floorboards of the bench. She kept her hands wrapped tight in the leather driving lines. The bandit laughed. He tracked her movement. He lowered the shotgun barrels. He aimed at the wooden bench. He prepared to squeeze the triggers. The buckshot possessed the power to shred the wood and the flesh beneath it. Thomas moved. The 10-year-old boy rose from the floorboards. He ignored the flying lead. He ignored the terrifying speed of the runaway wagon. He climbed onto the right side panel. He balanced his boots on the shifting, bouncing wood. He held the spare Colt cylinder in his right hand. The solid steel and 6 heavy lead bullets weighed 2 pounds. He gripped the center pin. He remembered the instructions in the rock fissure. He used the weight. The bandit saw the boy. He hesitated. He expected a grown man. He expected a rifle. He saw a child with an empty hand. Thomas threw his right arm forward. He hurled the loaded steel cylinder. He put the strength of his back and his absolute terror into the throw. The heavy cylinder crossed the 5 feet of empty air. It spun end over end. The steel struck the bandit dead center in the face. The impact delivered pure trauma. The solid iron block crushed the bridge of the man's nose. It shattered his cheekbones. The sound mirrored a blacksmith hammer striking a melon. The bandit screamed. The massive impact threw his head backward. His hands convulsed. His fingers jerked the double triggers. The shotgun fired. The blast of buckshot tore through the night air. The lead missed the wagon by 3 feet. It shredded the dry sagebrush on the side of the trail. The man dropped the empty shotgun. He clutched his ruined face with both hands. Blood poured through his fingers. He lost his balance in the saddle. He tipped sideways. Eldridge saw the opening. The wagon sideboards cleared his line of sight. He raised the Colt peacemaker. He leveled the heavy barrel at the man falling from the horse. He squeezed the trigger. The .45 caliber bullet struck the bandit in the right ribs. It punched through the canvas coat. It shattered the bone and pierced the lung. The man fell from the saddle. He hit the hard desert floor. He tumbled through the rocks and scrub brush. He left a trail of blood and broken bone. His horse bolted away from the gunfire into the dark. Eldridge rode past the fallen man. He kept the Colt aimed. He offered 0-second glances. A dead man presents 0 threat. He looked at the wagon. Thomas dropped back into the bed. The boy landed hard on the floorboards. He grabbed his youngest sister. He pulled her under the soot-stained blanket. Eldridge spurred the bay. He pulled alongside the driver's bench. "Keep them running," Eldridge yelled over the noise. Cora sat up. She wiped dirt from her face. She cracked the leather lines over the mule's back. She demanded speed. "The boy threw the iron," Cora shouted. "We hold 0 reloads." "He bought your life," Eldridge said. "The ledger balances. Drive." Eldridge dropped back to the rear guard position. He thumbed the hammer of the Colt back to full cock. He checked the cylinder. 5 rounds remained in the gun. 1 round remained for the Springfield. 6 bullets total to hold off Bonner and 3 riders. The remaining bandits adjusted their formation. They learned from the shotgun flank. They stayed back in the dark. They fired their Winchester rifles from a distance. They aimed for the iron wheels. They aimed for the blind horses. Lead peppered the dirt around the buckboard. The iron wheels struck a patch of uneven bedrock. The wagon launched into the air. It slammed back to the earth. The impact shook the teeth in Eldridge's skull. The rawhide patch holding the splintered axle brace groaned under the strain. The pursuit drove them deeper into the foothills. The flat desert gave way to jagged ravines and steep inclines. The darkness hid the hazards of the terrain. Eldridge read the layout of the land. He recognized the shape of the ridges against the stars. Fort Wallace sat in the valley on the other side of these rocky hills. They needed to cross the crest. They needed the high ground. "Push the team up the grade," Eldridge roared. Cora whipped the blind animals. The wagon began the steep climb up the mountain trail. The mule bawled and strained against the heavy leather harness. The mustangs fought the bit. The iron wheels ground against the solid rock. Bonner spurred his massive roan stallion. He fired a steady stream of lead at the rear of the wagon. He wanted to break the rig before the crest. He wanted to finish the slaughter in the dark. Chapter 18. The mountain trail punished the wagon. The steep grade demanded a brutal toll from the exhausted animals. The mule drove its hooves into the loose rock. The mustangs fought the heavy leather harness. They slipped on the jagged shale. Sparks flared under their iron shoes. The buckboard hit a massive slab of uneven bedrock. The iron wheels slammed against the solid stone. The heavy wooden frame absorbed the shock. The violent jolt traveled down the hickory axle. The rawhide bindings holding the ironwood patch stretched tight. The leather cured in the desert heat over the past 10 hours. It lost its elasticity. It turned brittle. The rawhide snapped. The sound mimicked a gunshot in the cold mountain air. The thick leather strips unraveled. The ironwood block shifted. The extreme weight of the loaded wagon bed pressed down on the compromised timber. The dense ironwood shattered. The dead root splintered into a dozen jagged spikes. The right rear corner of the buckboard dropped. The raw iron axle slammed into the rocks. The right wheel canted at a harsh angle. The iron spokes ground against the wagon bed. The rig skidded. Momentum carried the crippled heavy wood forward. The broken axle carved a deep gouge in the mountain trail. A shower of white sparks erupted from the grinding iron. Cora hauled the driving lines. She screamed at the team. The mule planted its front legs. The mustangs braced their weight. The animals slid backward. The wagon twisted on the narrow trail. The rear wheels kicked over the outside edge of the path. The buckboard stopped. The rear half of the wooden bed hung suspended in empty space. The crippled iron axle caught the lip of the rock face. The thick stone held the weight of the rig. It prevented a total plunge into the dark. Eldridge hauled the reins. The bay horse stopped a few yards behind the shattered wagon. Eldridge dropped from the saddle. He kept the Colt Peacemaker in his right hand. He walked to the edge of the trail. He looked down. A sheer black void gaped below the wagon wheels. The rock wall dropped straight into a deep ravine. The wind howled up from the darkness. It carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He shifted his gaze across the vast expanse of the valley floor, a mile below. A cluster of yellow lights broke the total dark. The lanterns burned steady and bright. They formed a rigid square against the black terrain. High wooden palisades caught the faint illumination. Fort Wallace. The sanctuary sat in the valley. A mile of vertical descent separated the broken wagon from the badge. Eldridge read the layout of the path ahead. He scanned the trail leading away from the shattered buckboard. The wide wagon ruts ended at the lip of the ravine. The path turned into a narrow goat track. The ledge hugged the sheer cliff face. It dropped down the mountain in a series of harsh, tight switchbacks. Loose gravel coated the narrow stone shelf. "The rig is dead," Eldridge said. His voice cut through the wind and the heavy breathing of the exhausted animals. Cora climbed down from the driver's bench. She walked to the edge. She looked at the narrow goat track. She looked at the lights in the valley. "The fort sits close," Cora said. "We hold the distance." "The trail starves the wheels," Eldridge said. "The ledge offers 3 feet of width. It holds 0 space for a wagon. It holds 0 space for a horse. A massive animal panics on that loose gravel. A horse steps wrong, it falls a mile. It takes the rider with it." Cora looked at the 6 children huddled in the tilted wagon bed. They clung to the high side panels. They stared at the black void beneath the rear tailgate. "Get them out of the bed," Eldridge said. "Move them to the solid rock." Cora reached over the sideboards. She grabbed the youngest girl. She hoisted the child over the wood and set her on the trail. Thomas climbed out next. The 10-year-old boy turned and helped his younger sisters over the side. They stood shivering on the mountain path. The wind bit through their thin cotton clothes. Thomas stood before Eldridge. The boy held empty hands. He offered 0 complaints about the cold. "I threw the iron," Thomas said. "I lost your bullets." "You crushed a man's face," Eldridge said. "You stopped a shotgun blast. You bought the miles. The ledger balances." Eldridge pointed down the narrow goat track. "You take the point position," Eldridge said to the boy. "You lead your sisters down the switchbacks. You test the loose rock with your boots. You find the solid footing. You hold the rock wall tight. You offer 0 glances down at the drop." Thomas nodded. He turned to the girls. He grabbed the hand of his younger sister. Eldridge looked at Cora. "You take the rear guard for the children," Eldridge said. "You keep them moving. You ignore the cold. You ignore the dark. You reach the valley floor. You run for the wooden gates. You scream for the badge." Cora pulled a heavy canvas canteen from the wagon bench. She slung the strap over her shoulder. She looked at Eldridge. She looked back up the steep trail they just climbed. The echo of galloping horses carried on the wind. Bonner and his 3 remaining men pushed their mounts up the grade. The pursuit closed the final gap. "They possess the horses," Cora said. "They ride us down on the trail." "They abandon the horses at the top of the pass," Eldridge said. "They must walk the goat track. They match your pace." "They hold the rifles," Cora said. "They shoot us from the cliff." Eldridge stepped away from the ledge. He walked to the bay horse. The animal stood chest deep in white lather. Its sides heaved. The horse gave everything to the trail. Eldridge reached under the horse's belly. He unbuckled the heavy leather cinch. He pulled the saddle from the bay's back. He dropped the heavy rig into the dirt. He stripped the leather bridle from the horse's head. He slapped the bay on the rump. "Run," Eldridge commanded. The horse snorted. It turned. It trotted up the trail, moving past the broken wagon. It disappeared into the dark brush on the high side of the ridge. Eldridge walked to the front of the buckboard. He drew his heavy Bowie knife. He sliced through the thick leather harnesses connecting the Mustangs and the mule to the doubletree. He freed the animals. He slapped their flanks. The team scattered into the dark timber. He stood alone on the trail. The crippled wagon sat jammed across the path. The heavy wooden bed and the high sideboards blocked the entrance to the narrow goat track. It formed a solid timber barricade. He sheathed the Bowie knife. He unslung the Springfield carbine from his shoulder. "I hold the high ground," Eldridge said. "I own the choke point. I block the pass. You walk." Cora stared at him. The wind whipped her torn dress. She understood the layout. She understood the math of the bullets. She knew the tall man in the canvas coat offered his life to buy their descent. "We hold a debt to you," Cora said. "The contract requires completion," Eldridge said. "The delivery remains unfinished. Walk." Cora turned away. She gathered the children. She guided them past the front of the broken wagon. They stepped onto the narrow stone ledge. The darkness swallowed them. The sound of their boots on the loose gravel faded into the wind. Eldridge stood in the center of the mountain trail. He stood in front of the shattered buckboard. The cliff wall rose on his left. The sheer drop fell away on his right. The trail funneled any approach straight into his line of sight. He flipped the trapdoor of the Springfield open. He felt the brass rim of the single cartridge in the chamber. He snapped the breech shut. He thumbed the heavy hammer to full cock. He listened to the canyon. The drumbeat of hooves grew loud. The scrape of iron horseshoes striking stone echoed up the steep grade. Eldridge raised the heavy steel barrel to his shoulder. He leveled the sights on the center of the dark trail. He stood like a statue in the cold wind. He waited for the hunters. Chapter 19. The drumbeat of hooves ceased. The sound of iron horseshoes striking stone faded into the howling wind. Leather saddles creaked. Heavy iron bits jingled. The pursuit hit the dead end. The wide trail bottlenecked into the narrow goat track. The rock shelf offered a meager 3 feet of width. A sheer drop yawned into the black void on the right. The horses balked. They smelled the empty space. They felt the unstable gravel under their hooves. They refused the path. "Dismount," Bonner roared. His voice carried over the wind. It echoed off the sheer granite cliff face. 4 pairs of heavy boots hit the stone. The men abandoned their terrified animals. They stepped onto the narrow ledge. They entered the choke point. They faced the shattered buckboard wagon, blocking the trail. They faced the tall man, standing in the center of the path. Eldridge stood like a granite pillar in the howling wind. He kept the Springfield .45 to 70 carbine raised to his shoulder. He closed his left eye. He aligned the iron sights. He ignored Bonner for the opening shot. The gang leader wore the thick buffalo hide. The heavy hair and thick leather absorbed lead and deflected glancing hits. The men beside him wore thin canvas dusters. They offered soft targets. Eldridge settled the front steel post on the chest of the lead scout. The scout raised his Winchester. He tried to acquire a target in the dark. He searched for the silhouette against the broken wagon. Eldridge squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle roared. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the muzzle. The recoil slammed into Eldridge's right shoulder. A dense cloud of white sulfur smoke plumed into the cold mountain air. The heavy lead slug crossed the 30 yards of stone path. It struck the lead scout in the throat. The impact delivered pure devastation. The .45 caliber bullet severed the spine. It pulverized the neck bone. The man collapsed. He folded backward. His boots slipped on the loose gravel. He tumbled over the edge of the narrow shelf. He vanished into the black abyss. A mile drop awaited him. He offered 0 screams. 3 men remained on the ledge. Eldridge flipped the trapdoor mechanism open. He extracted the hot brass casing. He tossed it onto the stones. The empty shell chimed against the rock. The Springfield held 0 rounds. The heavy iron and wood turned into a useless club. Eldridge tossed the carbine aside. The weapon clattered against the side of the crippled wagon. He reached for his right hip. His fingers closed over the walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker. He cleared the leather holster. He thumbed the heavy hammer back to full cock. 5 bullets remained in the steel cylinder. 3 men blocked the path. The layout favored the revolver. The tight confines negated the range of their rifles. Eldridge stepped away from the broken wagon. He abandoned his cover. He walked out into the open path. He took measured strides. He advanced on the three men. He operated on a pragmatic philosophy of violence. A static target dies. A man hiding behind wood waits for a fatal angle. A walking man controls the layout. A walking man forces the enemy to adjust their aim. A walking man presents a terrifying image of absolute resolve. It shatters the nerve of the shooter. Bonner raised his silver-plated Winchester. The two remaining scouts leveled their rifles. "Tear him apart," Bonner screamed. A wall of lead met Eldridge. Muzzle flashes strobed in the dark. Gunfire battered the eardrums. Bullets shattered the air around him. A slug chipped the granite cliff wall near his head. Stone shrapnel bit his left cheek. Blood welled from the cuts. Another bullet struck the splintered hickory axle of the wagon behind him. Wood fragments rained down on the trail. Eldridge kept walking. He kept his eyes open. He ignored the blinding flashes. He ignored the flying stone. He tracked the men through the smoke. A bullet found flesh. The heavy lead tore through the left side of his canvas coat. It pierced his cotton shirt. It grazed his ribs. The bullet parted the skin and shaved the bone. The impact spun him half a step. Pure fire radiated through his torso. The wind hit the open wound. The cold air amplified the burning pain. Hot blood soaked his shirt. It plastered the cotton to his side. Eldridge ignored the pain. The pain meant the heart still pumped. The pain meant he still breathed. He leveled the Colt Peacemaker. He sighted the scout on the left flank. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked in his hand. The .45 caliber bullet struck the scout in the stomach. The man folded forward. He grabbed his gut. He dropped his rifle. Eldridge thumbed the hammer back. He fired a second time. The next bullet hit the folded man in the crown of his head. It shattered the skull. The man pitched forward onto his face. He hit the stone shelf. He lay still in the gravel. Two men remained. The scout on the right flank panicked. He saw the tall man walking through a hail of bullets. He saw his partners die. He worked the lever of his Winchester with frantic, jerky motions. The action jammed. A brass casing stuck in the breech. The metal wedged against the extractor. The scout clawed at the hot brass. He abandoned his cover. He stared at the jammed mechanism. Eldridge offered him zero time to clear the weapon. Eldridge aimed. He fired. The bullet punched through the scout's left eye. It destroyed the brain. It blew out the back of his skull. A mist of blood and bone painted the rock wall behind him. The man dropped the useless rifle. He fell backward onto the path. The gunfire ceased. The echo rolled down the canyon. The wind reclaimed the silence. Eldridge stood 10 feet from Cale Bonner. Bonner lowered the silver Winchester. He looked at the bodies of his men. He looked at the tall man with the bleeding ribs. Bonner breathed heavy. White vapor plumed from his mouth. His face lost its color. The swagger vanished from his posture. Bonner backed up a step. His boot heel kicked a loose stone over the edge of the cliff. "I hold the silver," Bonner said. His voice shook. "I hold enough wealth in my saddlebags to buy a city." "You hold stolen rock," Eldridge said. "You hold a dead hand." Bonner held the silver rifle tight against his chest. "I offer you half. A king's ransom. You walk away. I turn my horse around. We call it square. We balance the book." "You murdered a town," Eldridge said. "You put innocent men in shallow dirt. You ordered the fire. The book remains open. The contract demands blood. Bonner gritted his teeth. He recognized the truth in the cold canyon air. He saw zero compromise in Eldridge's eyes. He saw zero greed. He faced a machine built for retribution. Bonner tightened his grip on the silver rifle. He tried to swing the heavy barrel up from his waist. He relied on pure desperation. He banked on speed. Eldridge leveled the Colt. He pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The heavy slug struck Bonner dead center in the chest. The bullet punched through the thick buffalo coat. It shattered the sternum. It pierced the heart. The impact halted Bonner's motion. The silver Winchester slipped from his hands. It clattered against the rocks. The engraved metal scratched against the rough stone. Bonner gasped. His eyes went wide with shock. He took a staggering step backward. His boots caught the edge of the precipice. He fell to his knees on the stone path. He clutched his ruined chest with both gloved hands. Blood poured through his fingers. It stained the thick buffalo hair a dark, wet crimson. He looked up at Eldridge. He offered 0 words. His lungs filled with blood. Eldridge walked forward. He closed the final gap. He stood over the kneeling man. He looked down into Bonner's face. He saw the terror of the end. He saw the realization of a failed life. "The ledger balances," Eldridge said. He raised the Colt Peacemaker. He leveled the heavy steel barrel at Bonner's forehead. He pulled the trigger. The bullet destroyed the skull. The concussive force pitched Bonner backward. The body collapsed. It hit the dirt path with a heavy thud. The corpse lay still on the mountain pass. Eldridge stood alone in the wind. He lowered the smoking revolver. He listened to the quiet canyon. Chapter 20. The sun breached the eastern peaks. Pale yellow light spilled over the high ridge. The shadows retreated into the deep rock fissures. The cold mountain wind died. Silence reclaimed the high country. Eldridge stood on the edge of the trail. The white gun smoke dissipated in the morning air. He opened the loading gate of the Colt Peacemaker. He ejected the empty brass. 5 metal casings hit the loose shale. They chimed against the stone. He reached to his leather gun belt. He pulled fresh rounds from the loops. He fed the heavy lead bullets into the iron cylinder. He snapped the gate shut. He returned the gun to the leather holster. He looked down at his heavy canvas coat. A ragged hole marred the fabric near his right side. Dark blood soaked the coarse material. The bullet tore through the coat and grazed his ribs. Eldridge unbuttoned the coat. He pulled his cotton shirt free from his belt. He inspected the damage. Blood seeped from a deep groove in his flesh. The lead gouged the muscle. It bruised the bone. The wound burned with a fierce heat. He ignored the pain. He ripped a long strip of fabric from his shirt hem. He secured the cotton around his torso. He bound the wound. He buttoned the canvas coat. He walked the killing floor. He checked the bodies. Bonner lay flat on his back in the dirt. His eyes stared at the dead sky. The 2 bullet holes in his chest leaked a dark pool into the dust. The silver-plated repeating rifle rested inches from his dead hand. Eldridge left the rifle. He left the men for the scavengers. He turned his back on the carnage. He walked to a cluster of scrub oak. The bay horse stood behind the brush. The animal survived the gunfight. It chewed a patch of dry yellow grass. Eldridge took the leather reins. He led the horse toward the narrow ravine path. The descent required absolute focus. The trail consisted of loose scree and sheer vertical drops. Eldridge placed his boots with brutal care. The steep angle punished his knees. The torn flesh on his ribs pulled taut with every step. He kept his breathing even. He maintained his balance. The horse followed his lead. The iron shoes slipped on the loose rock. Eldridge kept the reins tight. He kept the animal steady. They reached the valley floor. The ground leveled out. Thick buffalo grass replaced the broken stone. Fort Wallace sat a mile across the basin. High timber walls formed a massive square on the plains. Guard towers stood at the four corners. Soldiers walked the wooden parapets. Smoke rose from the mess hall chimneys. The heavy wooden gate faced the mountain pass. The settlement offered a fortress. It offered thick walls and federal law. Eldridge walked the bay horse out of the foothills. He spotted a whitewashed wooden post driven into the dirt. The boundary marker for the military reservation. Cora Jennings sat on the grass beside the post. The 6 children huddled around her. They shivered in the morning chill. The youngest girl coughed a wet, rattling sound into a soot-stained rag. Cora heard the horse. She raised her head. She saw the tall man in the canvas coat. She searched the brush behind him. She looked for the border gang. She saw 0 riders. She saw 0 dust clouds. Eldridge stopped the horse. He dropped the reins. Cora stood. She wiped a dirty hand across her face. She looked at the blood on Eldridge's coat. The gunfire stopped a long time ago, Cora said. The hunt is over, Eldridge said. Bonner is dead. His men are dead. They pose 0 threat to you. The oldest boy stood. Thomas stepped away from the women and the younger children. He looked at Eldridge's empty hands. He looked at the heavy Colt resting on Eldridge's hip. You killed them all, Thomas said. I balanced the ledger, Eldridge said. They butchered my father, Thomas said. They burned my home. And the men who did it feed the buzzards on that ridge, Eldridge said. The debt is paid. You let the anger die on the mountain. You carry it forward. It rots your gut. It makes you careless. You have sisters to protect. Thomas looked at the high ridge. He clenched his jaw. He gave a single nod. He stepped back to the group. A sound caught Eldridge's attention. He turned his head. 2 riders approached from the fort gates. They rode at a fast trot. The hooves beat a heavy rhythm on the dirt. The horses kicked up a cloud of loose topsoil. The men wore heavy brown wool coats over denim trousers. They carried Winchester rifles across their saddle pommels. Tin stars pinned to their chests caught the morning light. Local deputies. The gunfire on the ridge attracted their attention. Eldridge stood his ground. He kept his hands away from his weapons. The riders pulled back on their reins. The horses stopped 10 yards from the boundary marker. The animals blew air from their nostrils. Saddle leather creaked. The metal bits jingled. The lead deputy rested a leather-gloved hand on the receiver of his rifle. He possessed a thick mustache and hard eyes. He evaluated the scene. He looked at the soot-stained woman. He looked at the ragged orphans. He fixed his gaze on Eldridge. He noted the Springfield carbine in the saddle scabbard. He noted the heavy Bowie knife. He noted the fresh blood on the canvas coat. He catalogued the violence. State your business, the lead deputy said. These people require a doctor, Eldridge said. The girl holds smoke in her lungs. They require food. They require a telegraph office. The deputy narrowed his eyes. Who are they? Survivors, Eldridge said. A border gang burned the town of Silver Drift. They butchered the men. They stole the silver vault. Silver Drift sits a 3-day ride south, the deputy said. Through harsh country. The gang pursued the witnesses, Eldridge said. We took the harsh country. The second deputy shifted in his saddle. He pointed a finger at the mountain. We heard heavy rifle fire at dawn. We heard a war on the ridge. Where is this gang now? The lead deputy asked. Dead on the rocks, Eldridge said. 4 bodies at the top of the ravine. Bonner and 3 riders. Another man lies dead in the foothills. 2 more sit in the creek gorge. You can send a wagon to collect the bounties. The lead deputy looked at the steep mountain path. He read the layout of the terrain. He looked back at Eldridge. You took down Cale Bonner, the deputy said. The woman provides the testimony, Eldridge said. She knows the details of the raid. The children saw the faces. They hold the evidence. They are your witnesses. The deputy loosened his grip on the rifle. He looked at Cora. The suspicion left his eyes. The army surgeon works inside the walls, the deputy said. We maintain a boarding house. We can take them. Take them, Eldridge said. The federal marshal requires a sworn statement, the deputy said. You need to ride into the fort. You need to sign the paperwork. We need your name for the bounty claims. I hold 0 interest in paperwork, Eldridge said. The bounty on Bonner pays a massive sum, the deputy said. You earned the gold. The gold stays with the woman, Eldridge said. She lacks a husband. She lacks a home. The children need the silver to eat. Give her the bounty. Eldridge gathered the leather reins. He put his boot in the iron stirrup. He grasped the saddle horn. He swung his weight up. The movement pulled at his ribs. A fresh wave of pain hit his side. He kept his face blank. He settled into the leather seat. Cora stepped toward the bay horse. She stopped near the stirrup. She looked up at the man in the bloody canvas coat. You saved these children, Cora said. We owe you our lives. We owe you a massive debt. You owe 0, Eldridge said. The situation required a mechanic. I executed the job. He reached up with a gloved hand. He pinched the brim of his dust-caked hat. He tipped it to the woman. Eldridge turned the bay horse. He pulled the reins to the right. He faced the east. The morning sun washed over the open plains. He dug his spurs into the horse's flanks. The animal stepped forward. Eldridge rode away from the timber walls. He rode away from the survivors. He rode back into the hills. The end.